today. Yeah. Good morning, colleagues. Can you please take your seats as we need to begin the meeting? Thank you. Please take your seats. Please take your seats, colleagues. We need to begin the meeting. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. I hope you had a restful night and you are ready for the day. Thank you for your commitment yesterday. I think we had a very interesting day with high-level commitment and interactions. And also, we would love to have more time for discussion, but we can feel this level of commitment coming together, making sure that we can move together to address the most important issues we need to address at country level, but in a coordinated way for sustained impact. I think this is extremely important, taking into account everything else happening outside the NTD community, because we are not working, we are not living in isolation in this world. We have so many other health risks and platforms, and the people who are, trying to protect are exposed to other risks. We need to make sure that we take into account everything else happening and use existing avenue to be, more impactful. And today we have Pat Lamy from the Task Force for Global Health, who is going to lead the first session and towards sustainability of NTD intervention. I think this is the right time after all the discussion we have had on issues, challenges, and actions. So Pat, you have the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dr. Sose. It really is going to be an exciting morning here in terms of discussions. I would characterize the session as forward-looking, and our first presentation is going to take that concept forward, I think, with a great deal of style. So I'm very honored to introduce Emily Wainwright, who I would consider the Chief Strategy Lead for USAID. That means I actually don't know her real title at this point. So Emily, the floor is yours, and we're looking forward to a good presentation and hopefully some time for Q&A afterwards.
Great, thank you, Pat. I just want to say this is a tight 30 minutes that we were given to talk about a topic of sustainability that I think we're just only beginning to really grapple with. And so this morning, we want to take about 30 minutes to talk a little bit about sustainability and hear from some of our country counterparts who are taking this approach up quite seriously. Yesterday, I think in the afternoon, we heard a lot of insights from countries and just kind of the importance of multi-sector coordination and the opportunities that it's providing. And I think the three-pillar discussion really tees us up nicely to talk about the complementing document that came out of the roadmap, which is this document that you see up here on the wall, which is the sustainability framework for NTDs. There's also a training online. And it was really part of a process where WHO was looking at how do we move beyond disease-specific programs to really look at broader national systems and how these multi-sector approaches can really take advantage of the services and functions that exist at country level to ensure that we have sustainable NTD services. And I think for those who are working in the UHC space, and those at country level who are dealing with these issues, the optimization of resources at national level is really, really the conversation that's in play. USAID as a development agency really took the call for the sustainability framework and operationalizing it. We took it quite to heart. And we have had the opportunity over the last couple years to work with 15 countries to really help them think through a process where they're taking the sustainability framework and really turning it into plans with a vision that the countries are defining and taking a really look at how as a country do you define sustainability for yourself? How do you align the actors and countries around those priorities? And then where we've been fortunate enough, many of those countries have actually brought us into the process of helping them start to implement their sustainability framework. This process has been an interesting one, and out of it, we have started to develop what I would call is a series of principles that we're aspiring to that influence the way that we collaborate and work with governments. I wouldn't say that we're there yet, but these are principles that we are trying to strive for. They tell me I have to wait. Yep. Am I doing this wrong? Next slide. All right. So we have 5 principles that we're dealing with. This is great. Hey, I'm going to go through these one at a time, but I guess we'll get the full animation up. So these 5 core components have been kind of drivers for how we deal with this process. And the first one is really supporting a one government-led approach. No matter where the sustainability framework process starts, we're really working with governments to support them and get behind their approach, which in many cases is a multi-sector process, bringing in high-level multi-sector representation to develop the plan. The second principle that we have here is using national systems. We're finding that a lot of the services and issues that they're raising, there's a perfectly good system in country or a part of government that can help solve that problem, and really using those ministries, those service delivery platforms to actually do the work, solve the problems, and make sure that the solutions to that are ones that exist in country. The third principle is reinforcing government leadership and their ability to leverage national resources. It's been a really interesting process to revisit the kind of technical assistance that we're providing to governments as they look through their sustainability plans and are implementing various aspects. We find that sometimes technical assistance and support can actually undermine leadership at country level, and it can also undermine a government's opportunity to try to leverage resources from another ministry or another sector in country. And so it's really put us in a position of rethinking and very carefully collaborating with governments to give them the technical assistance that best supports them. Next slide. So the fourth principle is really monitoring against their goals and targets. They're creating these plans, and that our definition of success isn't our definition of success, it's their definition of success and what they're trying to achieve, and using those frameworks that way. Next slide. And then the fifth principle that I think many of us, we're a very impatient group, is that this takes time. Most of the governments that we have worked with, when they've even just the process of developing sustainability plans takes anywhere from about 6 to 18 months to get the right kind of engagement and work through it. If we're going to work with, if they're working with other sectors and really want to develop a long-term collaboration to benefit NTD services, that just takes the time to work within national systems. And so we're just learning that we need to operate at a different pace than maybe we've done with our traditional program support to things like mass drug administration. So looking at kind of these principles, one of the things I'd like to just use this as an opportunity to just give a taste of what this looks like. Next slide, please. And I want to be very clear. This is not all inclusive. This is what, as USAID and working with various governments, we are having the opportunity to see what's happening in country and potentially collaborate with governments. They're doing way more, but I think the important thing is we're not starting at ground zero when we talk about sustainability. Governments are actively working to address issues in country. You will see that many governments during the pandemic still continue to move forward and develop sustainability plans. Many of them are in the process or have had them politically validated at the highest level and are in the process of developing national accountability structures to track the progress that they're making. The orange bar, which I think is really exciting and is a theme that we've heard over the last couple days, is about multi-sector coordination. These governments are looking at existing structures where NTDs need to be at the table and can participate. Most countries are that we're working with are engaged in multiple platforms. It's not just creating an independent NTD multi-sector coordination mechanism. It's looking at relevant multi-sector coordination mechanisms in country and figuring out where NTDs needs to participate. Yesterday, I believe Ellen Agler challenged us to all be fundraisers. And an interesting emergence is this, you'll see in the blue space is how many, the governments are looking at all sorts of different ways of financing their NTD programs. So, a lot of them are looking at traditional budgeting and planning mechanisms in country and how do NTDs fit in that. Some are reviewing their health insurance schemes and ensuring that morbidity management services fit within them, or revisiting the essential package of care. And some are taking a look at where NTDs need to fit into district level financing mechanisms. But it's all to say a lot of the governments that we've been working with are starting to tackle these issues. They take time, but they're actually working across sector to get this, to start addressing these issues. Next slide, please. And I think many of these areas here, whether it's the HMIS, it's supply chain, it's workforce, or service delivery, the governments are looking at those functions in country and where NTDs need to reside. As a community, I think we've spent a lot of time focusing on how do you improve the drug application process or reporting to WHO, a lot of things that I think we're all quite well versed in. But this is really stepping outside of that and saying, how are these functions addressed in country? And how can NTDs leverage those platforms to provide those rotating services? Because this is the sort of platform that we're actually really going to need when we look at the 2030 goals. If we're not providing that platform, if those platform functions in country are not providing these services, they won't be sustainable. And I would say more importantly, we are creating and laying the groundwork for where do the other 15 diseases, how are they going to be addressed at national level? We've spent a lot of time on PC diseases, but I really think this work that countries are doing is ensuring and paving the way for how the other 15 diseases will be addressed in the long run. And so there's a lot of information behind this and a lot of time and energy that these countries are diving in, and there's many more countries that we're working with, and this is not all inclusive by any stretch of the imagination. But I think it's an important thing to actually have an opportunity to have our counterparts really talk about what that looks like. And so I'd like to pose a question to two of the colleagues in the room. And one, I'd like to reach out to Dr. Kabona from the Ministry of Health in Tanzania and just ask you to kind of give an example of how the work that you're doing with multi-sector coordination is allowing you to look at using national and national systems to better benefit NTD programs in your country.
Thank you very much, Emil, for a wonderful presentation. And for the interest of time, I will directly jump to respond to your question. No, Tanzania managed to develop the sustainability plan and launched it in the year 2021. And the challenges led to its development were considered around the 6 WHO health system building blocks. And you can see some have been presented what the status of the Tanzania. And now coming to this financing of the NTD program has been one of the main challenge for sustainability, and it was one of the starting point which we agreed to start with, because we had a number of challenges how to kick off the implementation of sustainability plan. We went direct and decided to start with the NTD financing, and we narrowed down to the subnational level at the districts. Now, how did we start? First, we had to analyze the stakeholders who are funding the NTD program, and the aim was to understand how much funding and the scope of funding and level of funding. And after identifying the stakeholders, we went down to the financial analysis. Actually, the aim of financial analysis was to understand the level of sources and funding, and also provide an evidence for advocates for additional resources for entities, and also establish a baseline where we can measure the change for the government funding as well as the external partners funding. And when we did the financial analysis, we involved just a few discs because of the financial constraint, looking at how that disc level NTD funding is. And we only realized that it's only 7% which came from the domestic funding, and the rest was from the donors. And we started from there. How do we strengthen the council, the district level budgeting and planning system? So we took a sample of 15 districts, which actually were criteria for selection was those with high endemic entities, with little or no budget for entities, and also most of them, they were the ones which were involved in the situational financial analysis. We realized they had little knowledge on how to plan and budget for entities, so we started building the capacity, and this was for the year. Actually, the analysis was for the year 2019 to 2020, and then we built it for capacity, and then we allowed them to go and the budget for the year 2022 and 2023. And after the budget was approved, then we went back for assessment. And the capacity actually targeted the people who are key stakeholders for the budgeting team at the district, which were district medical officers, district NTD coordinators, district planning officers, and also the health secretary, which is the actual custodian of the council comprehensive health plans. And after the budget approved, we went back and do the assessment of the impact of that capacity building. And what we found, actually, there was a substantial increase of the domestic funding from the 7% we saw to 26.9%, which was actually significant, and that was just within the sample districts. And through that, we realized it was possible to have the domestic funding at subnational level. And after that, we went for the pause and reflect meeting, and to just brainstorm around the lesson learned from the previous findings. And actually we ended up at that, actually in that pause and reflect meeting, again, it was a sectoral approach. We had all the ministers of health the President Office, Regional and Local Government Minister, which was actually the lead minister in this process, not the Minister of Health, and also we invited the Minister of Finance. We ended up actually identifying more gaps, and one of the gaps was we had inadequate budget ceiling for the disease, so that they cannot budget for entities, inaccurate data to use and to do the decision, evidence-based decision for entities budgeting, but also competing priorities at the district level. At the CCHP assessment, because after budgeting, then they go through the process of assessment whether the budget has fit all the criteria. We found there was some weakness. NTDs had the only 1 mark. When you don't budget for NTD, you score negative by 1 mark. So most of the councils didn't bother about the 1 mark because they can score 99 yet. So they just ignore it 1 mark. So we found that's the weakness. And also we had also found there's no proportion of percentage, how much should be budgeted for entities, and that again is a no weakness. If we even put $1, then the budget will go through. But going up to the Minister of Finance, we realized even the national document guideline for budgeting, there's nothing, a line item for NTDs, and we found that also is a weakness at the national level. And therefore, we agreed after that meeting, the President of Regional Authority and Local Government Ministry will lead the process to advocate to address these changes. And through that, we realize that we just took the key learnings from that process. Sustainability plan development is a key step towards sustainability of NTD programming in Tanzania, but multi-sectoral approach accelerates sustainability goals, and also sustainability goals need to be translated to lower levels of the health system, and the capacity building for the implementation is key. Thank you.
Dr. Cabona, I just want to thank you for I think that highlights real clearly that when we start looking at the problems that we're trying to solve, that sometimes it's, I think in the 80s we used to call it budgeting for bottlenecks, but it's like, where are those gaps in the system that need to be addressed, and how do we open up some of those channels that NTDs are missing out on? And so I think that just really kind of shows the complexity and yet the precision of the problem sometimes we need to solve. I'd like now to ask our colleague, Dr. Khan from the Ministry of Senegal, the same question to give us an example of how she's working in a multi-sector way to benefit NTD services in Senegal.
Donc, merci, Émilie. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je pense que vous pouvez porter vos casques pour... je dois parler français.
Très bien pour la diversité.
Donc, merci Émilie pour avoir en tout cas nous donné la parole pour parler un peu en tout cas de l'expérience du Sénégal dans la durabilité. Et je pense que c'est un point important. Hier, on en a discuté, on a parlé de l'intégration, on a parlé des financements, on a parlé de l'appropriation. Et on va aujourd'hui aussi mettre le focus sur la multisectorialité. Et je voudrais juste préciser que le Sénégal s'est engagé à atteindre les objectifs d'ici 2030, conformément à la nouvelle feuille de route de l'OMS. Et pour y arriver, il faut mettre en œuvre des actions soutenues, durables et multisectorielles au bénéfice des populations affectées par les maladies tropicales négligées. Et saisissant cette opportunité fournie par la feuille de route de l'OMS, notamment sur l'approche, sur le pilier 2 avec les approches transversales, donc le programme avec l'appui des projets ActOS, nous avons lancé dans un processus depuis 2019 d'élaboration d'un plan de durabilité. Et nous a permis, ce processus nous a permis d'avoir un plan qui allait de 2021 à 2023. Et nous avons aussi créé un comité national de lutte contre les maladies tropicales négligées. Cela nous permet de renforcer l'intégration des approches et la coordination multisectorielle, car vous savez que la multisectorialité est gage d'une gestion intégrée et durable des MTN. Et pour cela, le ministère de la Santé a mis en place un comité à travers un arrêté qui a été signé par le ministre de la Santé et de l'Action sociale. On a procédé au lancement de ce comité avec toutes les parties prenantes. Et là, je vais parler des secteurs de l'eau, éducation, élevage, il y a les autres ministères de l'économie, il y a aussi la société civile, les instituts de recherche et les autres, en tout cas, acteurs qui sont très importants, en tout cas, dans la lutte. Après cela, les commissions, on a 6 commissions. Ce comité est composé de 6 commissions. Et dans la commission WOSH, il y a la commission plaidoyer, mobilisation des ressources, il y a la commission technique avec la commission gouvernance, coordination. En fait, il y a 6 commissions et ces commissions sont réunies pour élaborer un plan. Chaque commission a élaboré un plan d'action pour mettre en œuvre parce que nous voulons une approche participative avec, dès le début, une planification conjointe. Quand on a élaboré le plan, on a fait la compilation de l'ensemble des plans d'action des 6 commissions. Après cela, on a procédé à la validation et à travers une réunion que le secrétaire général du ministre de la Santé a présidé. Et cela va nous permettre quand même de revoir en tout cas les actions, ce qu'on a prévu de faire à travers des approches novatrices. C'est important aujourd'hui, on doit parler de l'innovation. Parce que si nous voulons aller vraiment vers l'accélération de la, il faut des approches innovantes, il faut en tout cas des stratégies. Et parmi ces stratégies, je pense qu'aujourd'hui, ce que nous appliquons, c'est la décentralisation. Il faut aller vers les communautés. Et après avoir élaboré ce plan validé, aujourd'hui, nous sommes lancés dans un processus d'opérationnalisation du plan. Vous savez qu'on a élaboré un plan directeur et pour que les populations puissent s'approprier, pour que le niveau opérationnel puisse s'approprier de ce plan avec une approche multisectorielle, il faut aller vers les régions. Nous, on a entamé une dissémination de notre plan directeur. On va vers les régions, autour du gouverneur, avec toutes les parties prenantes, avec le secteur de l'eau, éducation, hygiène. On va partager notre plan. On va leur dire c'est ça, ce que nous voulons atteindre d'ici 2025, conformément à notre plan directeur. Et ça va leur permettre de s'intéresser au MTN. Après, on va discuter, surtout par rapport aux problèmes spécifiques pour les régions. Si on va dans la zone nord, on voit qu'il y a le problème de la bilharziose. Il faut une gestion intégrée avec le WOSH, donc avec l'éducation. Donc, on discute et ça va leur permettre de s'approprier. À la fin, on va travailler avec les équipes locales, les techniques, avec les régions, les districts, pour élaborer un plan. Et cela va nous permettre d'avoir une approche multisectorielle. On a commencé ce processus dans 4 régions. Vous savez que le Sénégal compte 14 régions, donc il faut aller. Mais il faut savoir aussi que ça nécessite un budget. Mais malgré tout cela, nous sommes en train de tout faire pour y parvenir. Parce qu'il faut qu'on décentralise nos actions. Il faut que le niveau opérationnel puisse en tout cas s'approprier. Parce qu'on a parlé de ça dans le pilier 3 de l'appropriation des actions. C'est pourquoi dans la durabilité, nous, on a vraiment senti qu'il faut une approche multisectorielle. Il faut que tout le monde y participe. On a aussi travaillé avec le ministère de l'eau, parce que lors du forum de l'eau à Dakar, on a organisé un panel avec le ministre de l'eau pour discuter sur les MTN. Et récemment aussi avec les nations, avec le sommet de l'eau au niveau des Nations Unies. Au niveau du Sénégal aussi, on a discuté avec le ministère de l'eau sur les actions. Et je pense que c'est ça qui est important. Aujourd'hui, nous devons mettre en place, en tout cas, nous devons faire pour que ce comité multifactoriel soit fonctionnel. Maintenant, pour revenir un peu sur l'intégration et le financement. Aujourd'hui, au niveau du Sénégal, comme je l'ai dit, on commence à vraiment impliquer davantage le ministère de l'économie. Et aujourd'hui, avec les changements, parce qu'on ne parle plus de ligne budgétaire, on parle de budget programme. Et nous, comme nous sommes dans le programme de base Santé 2, donc on est en train de discuter, on a élaboré un projet qu'on a soumis au ministère de l'économie pour qu'on puisse l'approuver, pour que le MTN puisse avoir un budget comme les autres programmes, à savoir le VIH, le paludisme. Et je pense que nous sommes en tout cas déterminés et nous sommes avec un fort plaidoyer. Il faut quand même qu'on puisse mobiliser plus de ressources domestiques. C'est ça la durabilité. Et créer un cofinancement. On est conscient de cela et on va continuer le plaidoyer pour que le financement puisse nous parvenir, pour qu'on puisse en tout cas assurer sur cette durabilité. Et je voudrais aussi parler de la formation, de la sensibilisation des parties prenantes de ce comité multisectoriel. Donc il faut que ces comités soient bien sensibilisés. soit bien orienté. Et là, je voudrais faire un plaidoyer pour les partenaires qui sont là pour l'OMS, parce qu'on a vu que, comme en tant que pays francophone aussi, je dois faire un plaidoyer pour qu'on puisse, en tout cas, les documents. Il y a beaucoup de documents en anglais. Non, il ne faut pas oublier aussi nous, en tant que pays francophone, parce que c'est important. Il faut que les gens comprennent ce qu'on dit sur les MTN. Donc, si on a tous les documents en anglais, ça va être très difficile pour nous, en tout cas, de continuer d'assurer cette durabilité. Et je pense que c'est ça qu'on est en train de faire au niveau du Sénégal. Et je pense que nous souhaitons, en tout cas, l'appui pour continuer, en tout cas, assurer cette durabilité. Comme je l'ai dit, l'intégration, on n'en a parlé plus, parce que hier, j'ai parlé un peu de l'intégration au niveau du Sénégal. Et ce qu'on est en train de faire avec le paquet de base qu'on va intégrer, il y a un projet pilote pour intégrer les MTN dans le paquet de base au niveau des districts, parce que c'est ça la durabilité. Merci.
I just want to thank Dr. Khan, also, I think, conveying the complexities of the issues that governments are dealing with. When we call for multi-sector coordination, I think both Dr. Khan and Dr. Kabona have really, mapped out it's not a simple undertaking. It requires a lot of strong leadership and coordination at country level and a lot of planning and mapping that out. And I think that comes back to one of the principles we deal with is having the time and the patience to work with governments as they go through that process, because it's clearly the way we are going to move forward. Dr. Lammy, I'm going to look at you because I don't know if we have time to take a question or two, or do we need to move on since I am not the moderator of the day?
I think it's important to give an opportunity for one key question.
All right.
Do we see a hand?
Do we see a hand? Oh. Well, there, of course.
I will speak in Wolof. Non, merci beaucoup. Je suis rassuré de voir que les pays investissent sérieusement dans la durabilité. Parce qu'il est important de savoir qu'on ne peut pas lutter contre ces maladies en tant que priorité de santé publique dans les pays en se basant juste sur les financements extérieurs. Donc, cette appropriation par les pays, ce leadership et le travail avec les autres secteurs, y compris le ministère de l'économie et des finances, pour avoir des budgets durables, une approche extrêmement importante. Je pense qu'on a vu pendant la période de pandémie et même maintenant les signes d'essoufflement de la part de beaucoup de partenaires. L'enveloppe globale pour la santé mondiale ne va pas beaucoup changer. Donc, il est important qu'on puisse avoir d'autres ressources plus solides, plus prévisibles au niveau des pays. Et ce travail sur la durabilité doit être une priorité pour tous les partenaires, pour s'assurer qu'on veut vraiment travailler pour renforcer les capacités des pays et protéger les personnes les plus vulnérables. Merci.
Yeah, thanks very much for that intervention, Dr. Sose. I think really an important topic to carry forward in the discussions throughout the day. We're going to pivot very quickly to the next topic on the agenda, which is surveillance and M&E for NTDs. We have a great lineup of speakers. I'll introduce them one by one. I'm going to remind our speakers that we are on a tight schedule this morning. And Farah has that little alarm that she'll be ringing once you hit that magical 7-minute mark. So I don't believe I heard it yesterday. I understand that it was used at least once, but we'll try to avoid it this morning. I think that as we all know from the discussions yesterday, the monitoring evaluation is really one of the central pieces that's really holding the meeting together in terms of providing measures of the programmatic impact and providing the credibility around the program accomplishments that communities and donors need. So these are some of the issues that you're going to hear. Our first speaker this morning is going to be Philippe Boucher, the team lead for data exchange at WHO. It is going to be tackling the important issue of how the WHO's new World Health Data Hub is going to help to reduce the data fragmentation that we're so familiar with in the NTD community. Dr. Boucher.
Hi, everyone. So thank you for having me. So first, oh, wait. Okay, I can't. It's not switching. Right, thank you. So, thanks. So let's see, does this one work? Yeah, this one works. Okay. Right, sorry about that. So, before I can address like the questions that were given to me for this panel, I think it makes more sense to first very quickly do the 60-second introduction to what the World Health Data Hub is, because I think most of you in the room won't have encountered it yet. So basically, what is this thing? So the hub is part of GPW 13. So when Dr. Tedros took over WHO several years ago, he set forward this transformation agenda, and part of the agenda was the modernization of WHO's end-to-end data process. So what the World Health Data Hub is a set of infrastructure and services, tools, and standards that are used to modernize how WHO runs its end-to-end data processes across the entire organization. And this is for technical data, so scientific data, public health data. It's not the administrative part. So the way that this works is at the very base, we have a data storage service that allows us to safely and securely hold all of WHO's data, and we can hold both structured and unstructured data for any technical program, and then we can restrict or share access as the program requires. So it's one singular place where everything can go. So that forms the base of the hub. And then around it, we've implemented the key components of what our high-level end-to-end processes look like when we're dealing with data. So the first part is we've got a consultation and collection piece to the cycle, and this is we call this the beginning usually, but actually as technical programs onboard onto the hub, they can actually start at whichever part of the data cycle that makes most sense for them at the time of onboarding, and then they can jump in and out as needed. So the consultation and collection part is basically managing the data collection processes so that we're able to track what's going on in terms of collecting, acquiring, and manipulating data. And the consultation part is actually sort of like closer to the end, is once we've got modeled estimates and we want to go back to our member states and validate them and get approval and consultation on that, we do it through this country engagement portal as well. So the next part of our cycle is the cleaning and the modeling and the analysis part. So this is basically where we just process the data and actually extract knowledge out of information. Then we've got the harmonization and storing component of the process, which takes outputs of analysis, takes raw data, and makes them available first internally in a harmonized structured form. And then the last part is we have a dissemination mechanism, which we use to share the data both internally and externally. So on the external side, it's data.who.int, which is a website that's coming online. Is basically everything data related is going to end up in data.who.int across WHO. So I'll cover the relevant parts in a little bit more detailed shortly. And just for one last piece of background, so this is what is done in the NTD department right now. This is actually applicable to pretty much any technical program inside WHO. We collect data through a variety of different means, different tools, different networks, different approaches, and we try to consolidate them. And then once we've done our analyses, we roll them out through different products and platforms, services, sometimes internal, sometimes external. So one of the things that we want to do with the hub is, if you're looking at an approach like this, you can see that there's a lot of silos. So like part of the hub is to actually break down these silos. And what we want to do is basically take all of these different approaches with the hub, we consolidate them into a smaller set, which are more controlled and more harmonious with each other and more consistent, so we can jump back and forth. In terms of the engagement of the data exchange unit with NTDs right now, is we've been working with the department on the, I'm gonna say GNARF, but I'm not actually quite sure that's the right way to pronounce it, but the GNARF, which is a consolidated form to collect data on all of the 20 NTDs in one go. So with this, it would go through the hub and then be processed there and then be made available back into NTD's SMART system, which is its own consolidation point, but we can also consolidate it within the World Health Data Hub as well. So that's the background. And then to give more precise answers to the questions I was given. So the first one that I got was, how will the World Health Data Hub address the data fragmentation and reduce the collection burden on countries while taking into account programmatic needs for the 20 NTDs? So in terms of our service stack right now, the big part that we have that does this is actually the country portal. So NTDs have developed the GNARF forms in order to collect data. So what we're doing with the country portal is we're helping to manage the process so that we can do a number of different things with this. First of all, it allows us to completely track the status of what's going on, like who's collecting what, which country is entered, which data where, and we can basically follow all of this in real time. The country portal also gives us the ability to facilitate communications with the various stakeholders that we have involved in the process. So this is really important. In the past, most of these kinds of activities were done sort of in a piecemeal approach with communication over phone, email, chat messages. And a lot of this history can get lost or confused. So one of the things that the country portal does is actually provides you a managed environment where you can have all of these communications between your various partners. It tracks everything. We're also working on translation capabilities inside the system as well. So you can comment in one language to an individual who's collecting data for you in one country, and that individual is actually going to see that comment in a language that they're more likely to know. So we're currently developing that capability. And as we do this process through the country portal, we're also able to see load. So we're able to see who's being tasked with reporting what kinds of data, so we can see actually if they're being overburdened with multiple tasks. So while this is going on, we're also doing consultation processes for other programs and validating estimates and so on. So we're also then able to see if there's a sort of a load conflict with individuals who are tasked with doing this data collection exercise, but at the same time, they're being tasked to do a whole bunch of other validation activities for their programs. We can see that through the country portal. Once the data collection process is complete, then we have full and immediate access to all of the data that's been collected. And as part of the work with the data exchange unit, we're also putting in extraction processes for the GNRF forms so that as soon as data comes in, it's immediately available for analysis. And we can also do automated cleanup and harmonization of it. So it makes it really easy to jump right into the work of what needs to be done. So that's for the first one. And then the second question that we were asked was, how can the World Health Data Hub facilitate integration and mainstreaming of NTD data into information systems within the health sector? So I have 3 bullet points for this one, for the hub. So the first thing is the World Health Data Hub, what it really is meant to do, I mean, apart from making better end-to-end data management processes and services, it's really about collaboration. It's about breaking down the silos. So one of the things that needs to happen for NTD data to be more integrated into the health sector is you need to have a broader coalition of groups working on technical guidance, on standards and methods, for the acquisition, modeling, and processing and dissemination of data. So this works across the house, and I'll elaborate on that in a second. The second thing that the hub does is we are able to make raw and estimated actionable data broadly and easily available very quickly to relevant audiences, and that's inside WHO, but also outside WHO as well. So for ministries of health, for clinicians, for the general public, researchers, and so on. And then the third thing is, for this to really work, countries need to be supported so that they can transfer the specific methods that we use to do our own analyses on this data, and they be able to re-implement those within their own systems. So them being able to take the metadata that we use, the analytical code that we use, all of like the mathematical approaches to take all of that and make it available in such a way that it makes sense and it's easy for them to integrate this into their own health information system tooling, so that this will drive their own ownership of it. So a bit more detail on this. So I said the World Health Data Hub facilitates technical collaboration. So one of the things that we need to do in order to make this really work is, as we look across WHO, we've got different departments that can actually support this activity. So beyond the specific needs of what NTD needs to know in order to be able to do its own work, you can then augment that with support from the RHIS, the Routine Health Information Systems specialists that are inside DDI. There's also in the digital health department, they're working on the development of smart guidelines, which translate clinical and monitoring specifications into a form that computer systems can understand. And then we have our IT department that can also support some of the technology deployments. And then we've got data exchange also that can work on dissemination. So all of these things come together to produce content packages inside WHO and outside that facilitate the process. So that's the first thing. Then the second part was turning the data around. So it's important to be able to get process data available and disseminated to the people who need it for doing policy, like policy decisions, analysis, and so on. But one thing that's critically important that the hub can really shine at is that we can improve the transparency and the value of this data, but by actually showing you the whole chain that goes backwards from here's the final results that we calculated that we can share that people can use, to here are our methods, here's our code, here's our raw data, and actually make that completely transparently available to anyone who needs it. And in terms of being able to do basic science, being able to do operations, that level of transparency is really useful because you can pick and choose the things that are actually helpful to you, and you can implement that within your own systems, on top of which it adds a lot of transparency to WHO data itself so that you can see precisely where it all came from and how we get to our own conclusions. And the third part was, it's sort of related to the second part. For me, it's important that countries be able to implement a lot of this work in their own systems themselves. So by encouraging transparency within the World Health Data Hub, what we're able to do is we can point to things like, here are the relevant smart guidelines that you should be loading into your systems. So these are all standards-based. A lot of computer system will understand the guidelines because they're based on HL7 Fire. And so you just note, this helps you find which ones you will need in order to make this work. But then also by seeing the kinds of analyses that we do that we think are important, can also drive interest and can be replicated within a country's own systems, simply because they can now see the details of what's actually being done and what data actually led to the particular results that they see. So by the hub making this content available, then it helps countries then develop it themselves. And that's what drives ownership. And if you have ownership of this, then you're more likely to be able to integrate and sustain it within your own infrastructure. And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Philippe. I think in the interest of time, we're going to move right through the presentations, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions. So please hold your questions. Our next presenter will be Stéphane Duroy, who is the team lead for human-animal interfaces in the Health Security Preparedness Department at WHO. And he will be discussing how NTDs can draw from the work that's been done to strengthen country capacities around emergency responses. Stéphane.
Merci, Patrick. Thank you very much. And good morning, colleagues. I'm very happy to be here and to be the voice, one of the voice of the emergency program. I am in a special department. We are working on the preparedness. So I don't know if we are on the right or on the left of this big program of emergency. But what we are trying to do is to really work with country to build or to help them to build their capacity. And that's something that could be of interest in the context of this meeting. As we said, or as SOCE said, durability is important. And so we should probably take advantage of all the effort done in the context of emergency to see what can be also done for NTDs. So, ça marche pas. Next, merci. So, you know, for emergency, we have a special framework, which is in fact more than a framework, it's a regulation. This is the IHR. You probably know very well this regulation. It's a legally binding instrument in which country confirm that they will develop the capacity to detect, to assess, to report, and to respond to major public health events. And we should potentially use these commitment to see how we can help the country to build these capacities for emergencies, but more globally for other issues that can also affect their capacity for infectious diseases. So associated with the IHR, we have developed a lot of tools and material that we, most of them are under what we call the monitoring and evaluation framework for the IHR, which is in fact a very logical cycle moving from assessment of capacity, identification of gaps, then the development of plan and implementation of this plan, the capacity building. All these, can we move to the next slide, please? All these at the end with different tools helping to build this national action plan for health security that you see in the middle of the circle. So some of the tools probably you heard about them. For example, the SPAR, the green one. The SPAR is the annual reporting that countries have to give to the Secretariat of the IHR every year during the World Health Assembly. Then other tools like the joint external evaluation, the GE, is a review by peers of the capacity of country for some of the key functions that we expect to see for the implementation of the IHR. And then you have other more functional tools like simulation exercise or after action review, interaction reviews. You also have some tools to assess vulnerability and the risk in countries. And something that is more closer to my here is the One Health tool. So the support to facilitate the collaboration between sectors. Because obviously, and this is the part on the right, these exercises need a lot of multisectoriality and a lot of partnership with different sectors in the society. So for example, you see the connection with the military forces. In fact, today we have a meeting between military and civil in another part of the WHO. We also see the connection with parliamentarians, and maybe you have heard about something important to improve the political will to engage in this process. The name of the process is UHPR, Universal Health Preparedness Review, which is discussing at the top level of the government this sort of issue. Then other technical area, including human-animal environment interface, and I know that my colleague from FAO, John Sia, just sitting in front of me, will talk a little more later today about that. Next slide, please. So I don't go into detail of all the tools, but just for you to understand that these tools are widely used in many, many countries. So for the SPAR, for example, obviously it's mandatory to report to WHO Secretariat, so we can understand that it is well used, but also the external evaluation are also, you can see that about 120 countries have already been through the process, and many of them have developed a national action plan. Let's move, please. What is also very important is that most of these tools obviously are absolutely crucial for the management of outbreaks, but not only, and many of them can be used in peacetime, not only for emergency or public health event of international concern. They have a lot of relevance for other issues when it comes to capacity building in countries. Let's move, please. And a special effort is made to integrate in this process some existing tools and plans that do exist in countries. For example, many countries have a specific plan for rabies or for influenza. So the exercise will try to integrate all these plans in the process. And then at the end, we can use some of this material and approach for some work that we can do together. For example, I'm very happy to work with NTD department here on rabies to see how we can use the approach that we develop for the collaboration between animal-human environment interface for emergency. In the context of rabies, we have a lot of material to help the country to engage in this sort of capacity building. Voila. So just to conclude, definitively, we will continue to work on this tool because this is a request in the context of emergency, but most of them build the capacity that we need to also cover other issues, including NTD. A lot of data, a lot of you know that we are generating a lot of data. So that is absolutely crucial to help the country developing their national action plan. The connection with health system to be sure that the system that we develop are not running in parallel, but are definitively integrated in health system strengthening is really key, because obviously that's one of the key lessons we learned from COVID, is that this connection should be strengthened. It's working very closely in the three levels of the organization with the regional offices and the country offices, and then a lot of partners around, as you can imagine, including our colleagues working on NTD. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. That was a lot of information presented very concisely. Our next speaker is going to offer a very different perspective. This is going to be Aidan O'Leary, who is coming from the WHO's Global Polio Elimination Program, and I think has really important lessons to share with the NTD community about reaching the unreached. Aidan?
Super. Thanks, Pat, and many thanks for the opportunity to participate. For the purposes of the 7 minutes, I won't use the slides. I'll use them as a pre-read. But there's maybe just 4 remarks that I'd like to zoom in for this particular conversation. And I think what I've been asked to really zoom in is hard to reach and zero dose. And the first point that I would make is epidemiology drives everything, but epidemiology varies. So for the polio program, we're essentially concentrated on 7 subnational geographies that lie between us and interrupting both wild and polio variant transmission worldwide. That is essentially 2 provinces in eastern Afghanistan, are previously controlled by Islamic State Khorasan. It's 7 districts in southern Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where we have low intensity conflict between Tehrik-Taliban Pakistan and the Pakistan Army. We have south central Somalia in the areas under the control of Al-Shabaab. We have northwestern Nigeria, the states of Sokoto, Zamfara, and Kebbi, where there is armed conflict between Hausa farmers and Fulani herdsmen. We have eastern DRC, where we have the conflict involving M23. We have northern Yemen, where we have the Houthis have blocked access. And then last but not least, where we've had the WPV1 importation in the northern Mozambique and its immediate hinterland. I think the important point simply to note is that, when we speak about the big catch-up and, for immunization post-pandemic, these children are children that were zero dose way before the pandemic and continue to be a challenge for the program. What we are dealing with is acute, protracted, complex emergencies. And what we have to continue to do is to work to find ways to reach these children moving forward. The second thing that I'd like to highlight is the importance of emergency operation centers at country level. So the polio program spans the emergency world. We're the last public health emergency of international concern, but we also span the zero dose agenda under IA 2030. And what's critical for us is that at country level, these EOCs bring together all partners under government leadership to do essentially 3 things. The first is to identify and assess risk, so we're clear about what needs to be faced. The second thing that we need to zoom in on is the coordination of operational response. And last but not least, is accountability and oversight. There is no performance, there is no improvement with proper accountability and oversight across all levels of government and all levels of the partnership. We will not succeed without effective emergency operation centres. The third point that I would highlight is there tends to be a huge focus and discussion around the relative merits of individual vaccines and countermeasures. And I think this is all very important, but what is actually critical for success is to bolster vaccination and ensure maximum coverage. And in practice, the issues that need to be addressed and need to be tracked operationally and logistically is issues around supply. Can we actually get the vaccines and countermeasures down to the areas where they're needed the most, with all the appropriate cold chains to assure effective delivery? The second thing that I would focus on is access. Can we access all the populations we need to access all the time? Where we have suboptimal access, how do we actually adjust our approaches to make sure they succeed? The third issue that I would highlight is community acceptance and trust. There's a huge focus on highlighting all the children that we reach and vaccinate. What is critical for programs is who are missing and why. Is it because they're not there? Is it because they're not counted? Is it because they refuse? If they refuse, why do they refuse? Is it vaccine acceptance? Is it other issues? Because what's important is that where we have misinformation, disinformation, and rumors, they're corrected with correct information delivered through the appropriate channels. And we need to have very granular information to make sure that this is systematically addressed. The last point that I would highlight under this particular operational piece is around the modalities that we use. So the modalities for polio, the preference is to go house to house. So that means when we go to a country like Pakistan to reach 43 million children under 5, we visit 30 million households plus in every nationwide campaign that we do. When we move to site, or when we move to mosque, whether through integration or for other reasons, what we find is we lose coverage. And we particularly lose coverage of the children who are most at risk and vulnerable, which are the children under 2 years of age. Because ultimately, caregivers, usually mothers, will not bring children outside the home to sites, particularly if they're more distant. We need to have this granular understanding of who we're trying to reach and why, what works, and more importantly, what doesn't work. Because we need to keep implementing, learning lessons, applying the lessons, and continuing to innovate in relation to the modalities that are used. The final point that I would make is around the importance of our verification. And there are two primary means available to the program for this purpose. The first is surveillance. And we have to recognize the virus never lies. Much as we might like what the surveillance system tells us, it never lies. So if the virus is there, it will reveal itself. And what is really important for us is that we have surveillance systems that are sufficiently sensitive to allow us to detect all transmission, but particularly in those subpopulations which we believe to be most at risk. The major issue we face as a program is not around sensitivity, it's around timeliness of detection. And again, that's something that we continue to work. The surveillance system informs both national decision-making, but it also informs the work of the regional and the global commissions for certification. So again, what we need to make sure is that it's fit for purpose. The last point that I would highlight in terms of verification is what has proven critical to the program over the years is independent third-party monitoring. And it sounds very simple, but actually it can be very difficult. And if I give the example of the wild polio virus 1 importation into Southeastern Africa in early 2022, we conducted a range of campaigns within 4 weeks of the initial detection. We were reporting or receiving reports of 120, 130% coverage. And yet our independent monitoring was telling us that the LQS pass rates ranged between 17 and 33%. So how do you reconcile this? So what we actually discovered as we worked through the year, and thanks to very courageous political decision-making, particularly in Malawi and in Mozambique, we started the 5-country response plans with a target population of 26 million. By the time we finished our immunization activities at the end of last year, we were vaccinating close to 40 million children under 5. And I highlight this because the assumption is that everything is correct until it's not correct. And if we're serious about the zero-dose agenda, we have to go and take those extra steps under the leadership of national governments to make sure that the appropriate course corrections are made. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Aidan, for a masterclass in 7 minutes. A remarkable amount of information packed in there. So I really appreciate your being here today. Next up is Luis Harda-Castellanos, who is the Unit Chief of Neglected Tropical and Vector-Borne Diseases in the Department of Communicable Diseases at PAHO. And he'll be talking about integrated serosurveillance, a specific topic that PAHO has really been in the lead on over the last few years. Luis Harda, over to you.
Thank you, Pat, and good morning, everyone. We're going to break the ice a little bit just to talk on innovation. And I'd like to start this by recognizing the brave decisions of countries of the Americas to take on innovation, because they're always wanted to do better, but to take innovation based on science and with careful analysis of what already exists. So we're going to talk just a little bit in a very short time on the background, what this multiplex initiative is, lessons learned so far, and how to make it sustainable. So the multiplex initiative in the Americas was launched in 2016, and it came thanks to the partnership with the Centers for Disease Control and 3 countries that decided to take it as a pilot project. The whole concept is using integrated serosurveillance to improve programmatic decisions. So this is not part of a science study. This is taking an innovative tool and put it to work into existing public health systems with 2 purposes: strengthen public health surveillance systems as they are and make them better. And number 2, use the MBA to measure antibodies for multiple pathogens simultaneously. According to technology now, you can measure up to 500 in a single drop of blood. So there are 3 surveillance scenarios in which we can use this, and countries are doing it. Number 1, when there is non-surveillance system or there is one very weak. So we use serosurveillance to grasp and construct the baseline information of data that otherwise will be very hard to collect. Number 2, the opposite, when we already have very strong surveillance systems or documented interventions and we want to do very robust measurements of results, that being, for instance, the coverage of vaccination or the distribution of specific disease. The number 3 is what we're promoting now in the Americas, is the post-elimination surveillance. Countries are achieving elimination of surveillance to a different extent. So they are looking for very efficient ways of doing post-elimination surveillance. Why PAHO did this? Because since 2016, we already had a countries-based approved resolution mandating to move forward for integrated regional plan for elimination of NTDs in the Americas. This resolution was done in 2022, but by 2019, PAHO and countries of the Americas have already made the decision to implement what's now called the Disease Elimination Initiative that aims at interruption and elimination of more than 30 infectious diseases and conditions in the region as a whole. Why that is important? Because in the first phase, we were trying just to pilot it and see what problems countries will face as using a new technology in the existing surveillance systems. What we have found is that it takes a lot of energy to do that in each different scenario by country. So on the first phase, we integrated the zero surveillance systems in 3 specific countries to do NTDs, vaccine preventable diseases, foodborne diseases and others. We transferred technology thanks to the Centers for Disease Control. And then we also took advantage of 2 additional countries eager to take this technology into previously planned national surveys. On the expansion phase that was planned for 2021, we were halted because of the pandemic. So we needed to make a stop there. So this slide, although very charged, is just to highlight 2 points. Number one, despite of the multiple challenges, countries like Mexico, Paraguay, Guatemala, Guyana, with the diversity of socioeconomic conditions, they did manage to do those surveys. Look at the number of antigens included in each of the surveys. Those are completed studies, completed efforts into the existing surveillance systems. And the data analyzed in the first 2 was done at country level. So Mexico and Paraguay have transferred technology, and now they can do it by themselves with support of CDC as the monitoring agency. And the other 2 countries agreed to have their data analyzed with support and being done with PAHO and CDC. In 2022, thanks to a number of partners, including countries and agencies, we were able to publish this toolkit for integrated zero surveillance of communicable diseases in the Americas that is basically composed out of 6 modules. The modules you'll see there are all available in English and Spanish at PAHO website, and this was developed in collaboration with CDC and with feedback from countries and their experience by implementing this initiative. In 2023, we're also able to publish in the PAHO Journal this lessons learned article in which we extensively explain others the difficulties of implementing new technologies when you wanted to do it into existing public health systems. I keep highlighting this because we're not forcing countries to move or change what they do. We're, on the contrary, adjusting ourselves to put these new technologies to serve the purposes of countries by using what is already there. I thank the countries in green, which took the great initiative of being the pilots, but I also want to thank Chile and Argentina, who as of this year officially request PAHO to join this initiative. We have basically drawn 3 important lessons on how to take these to countries. So if we wanted to really strengthen capacities in countries to use integrated zero surveillance for making programmatic decisions, we understand that this needs guidance. It's very complex for countries to do change into their systems and the mind, the way they think on how to do things. So a lot of guidance, technical guidance is needed. It takes time, as Emily previous said, countries are challenged to move ahead and do things. And I keep asking people to be patient because the effort and investment in times pays off later when the quality of results are worth enough the waiting. And number 3 is that it is more than just transferring technology. We as PAHO and CDC thought at the very beginning that 2 weeks of training in CDC labs and then 2 weeks of refreshing the technology in labs at the country level will do the trick, but it's not. It's much, much more than that. It takes integrated work, integrated planning, integrated implementation, integrated analysis and use of that information. So we concluded that for making integrated zero surveillance sustainable in functional public health surveillance systems into the Americas, we have 3 conditions that need to be fulfilled. Political engagement. So we keep pushing countries, as we did recently with these 2 last countries that apply, and told them, we can do this if the process is led by the government. not by us. We will just complementary provide the tools, but it needs to be led by the governments. Technical involvement is not just to call the head of the national laboratory and the head of the surveillance program. We need program managers, epidemiologists, biostatisticians, laboratory professionals, and many more to make it work. So the demand for integrated work is being put on place from the very beginning. And number three is this change in mind by innovative planning. It's for all components of serious surveillance to define the questions, design the protocols, having people from all of the involved programs. If you have 16 different antigens, you may need 16 different head of programs in the same table, deciding how we're going to do this. And it's not an easy task. We have had hundreds of meetings by now. So with that, I just want to acknowledge the Centers for Disease Control and the countries of the Americas that have taken this brave decision of continue to improve and do better with innovation. And we hope we will succeed soon by expanding this technology. Thank you, Pat.
Yeah, thanks so much, Luis Huerta, and kudos to PAHO for your leadership in translating innovation into public health practice. That was a great story. Next up is Dr. Paul Emerson, who is the director of the International Trachoma Initiative and Children Without Worms at the Task Force for Global Health. And he has been charged with the duty of telling us about the importance and the need for impact surveys. Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much. In other circumstances, this could easily be a half-day discussion, but today we're going to take just 5 minutes. And it has been my intention here to keep this discussion at a strategic rather than a technical level, and I've attempted to be acronym-free. What I want to convey by the end of this is that what gets measured gets done. So if you want to stop listening now, you can. The situation in our NTD programs has changed dramatically over the last 15 years. And we seem to be forgetting that or not focusing on that. The programs have been really, really successful. And it's time to demonstrate progress. There are still pockets, and we heard from Aidan about these hard-to-reach populations. We prefer to think of them as the must-reach populations that are left, who are still at risk of morbidity. And we need to be able to focus our resources, such as they are, on those people still at risk. In order to make then an evidence-based strategic plan, we need an accountability framework, and the accountability framework needs to be based on agreed upon indicators. And those indicators, we shouldn't paint ourselves into a corner. The indicators can change during the life of a program because the need to include people at the beginning is different to the needs when you are thinking about withdrawing an intervention or stopping a program. So there needs to be some flexibility. In our impact surveys, we need to make sure that nobody is left behind and we are focusing on the right people. Now, I used a lot of words that were presented yesterday on this slide, but we have to think at the very center of everything we do, is this activity going to provide service and reach the people who are at risk of the disease? And if the answer is yes, then we should go ahead and do it. The country program managers need to make decisions for their people, their families, their children, and they need those decisions to be justifiable, defensible, and consistent with WHO policy in order for the ministries at the higher up levels to agree with the policies. That's what our impact surveys will do. And for the country programs and the partners, when we collect standardized indicators in a standardized way, we can then message, we can convey valid, verifiable, transparent, and clear messages aligned to the roadmap and are consistent in time and space and audiences. So the same indicators used applied to different countries at different time points and with different audiences. And of course, this is going to be the basis of our accountability framework. In particular, the pharma companies need to have these impact data in order to forecast drug needs and put in plants to produce stuff, the medicines, which can take 3 to 5 years. I'm just going to now present a couple of examples. This is a dot density map of active trachoma, where we've got an agreed upon indicators, which were made in the 1980s. The map on the left is baseline, and the map on the right is current, showing the enormous progress in the trachoma program over the last 15 or 20 years. Next slide, please. And the purpose of this is demonstrative, and that is to show that in real time, as of June 2023, this is the number of people in the endemic countries who are still at risk of blindness from trachoma. And next slide, please. What I'm trying to get at here is, in order for the programs to work, quality data are a need to have and not a nice to have. Agreed upon indicators and agreed upon strategy to deliver the programs and agreed upon way to measure the indicators is essential and needs to be baked into the cake. But at this point, what normally happens, people will look at me and say, yeah, Paul, that's okay for trachoma because you're well-funded and what and what. And I say, no, that's absolute nonsense. It's rubbish. You say you can't afford the millions for decent database decision-making. How can you afford not to? We've heard in the last day about mismanagement of drugs. We've heard about maltreatment, people getting treatment when they don't need to. We've heard about drug expiry. How can you afford hundreds of millions of dollars on lost drug, but you can't afford a few $1 million on monitoring and evaluation? Next slide, please. And here's the example of that from Bangladesh. Bangladesh were using a population approach for their deworming program, where every child is offered twice per year treatment for a total in the blue box of 80 million doses of deworming tablets annually. After impact assessments and then a geostatistical analysis to map the prevalence across the country, you can see that the demand reduced from 80 to 40 million tablets. Now, I don't know what it costs to make, package, ship, store, take the drug to the distribution nodes and hand it out. If it's 50 cents per dose, that would be $20 million saved. If it's just 10 cents, it's 4 million saved. The total for all of this work was less than $500,000. So from just one country example, the savings in drug and focusing on the right people would more than pay for a global system. Thank you. Next slide, please. A little bit animated. There we are. Here it comes. I just went through that all very quickly. And I wanted to end here on a different tack, a different thought. Is we're talking about numbers, we're talking about population-based, but it's at the end of the day all about individuals. And we may disagree on things in this room, we may disagree on approaches, but in fact we are all working together with the same goal. And that is to relieve the stigma, misery, pain, and suffering from neglected tropical diseases because we care about the people who are at risk. Those people deserve our energy, they deserve our focus. And I would say that impact surveys and decent data-based systems allow us to give those people what they need. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paul, for the clarity and power of those comments. Much appreciated. We're going to go to the last speaker, and then we'll entertain some questions. And the next presenter will be Dr. Kashif Hijaz from the Carter Center, who is going to talk about a topic near and dear to the hearts of those at the Carter Center, and that's the last mile challenges. Kashif, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick, and the organizers for giving me this opportunity today. So I'm going to be bringing a little bit of change of taste to the session because it was all focused on surveillance. So this is related to some of the barriers which were identified yesterday, and also sort of setting the stage for accelerating progress, which is going to be this afternoon session as well. So next slide, please. So I'm going to be talking about some of the last mile challenges related to neglected tropical diseases. Generally, I'm going to describe about the overall challenges and then some specific challenges related to a subset of NTDs. So when you look at the overall last mile challenges, they are actually outlined on this slide over here. There are about 7 or 8 of them. The top most and the most important one is the sporadic and widespread political instability and conflict that we actually have to deal with in most of the countries that we work in, or several of the countries that we work in, which basically provides a barrier to access to some of the populations, which are nomadic populations or some internally displaced populations, as well as refugees. In addition to that, the impact of the climate change and the environmental changes, which were also pointed out yesterday by SOSE when you're looking at the climate change and its impact on NTDs, is another important factor and provides overall challenges when it causes famine, flooding, and vector movements, and also contributes to some of the IDPs and refugees. In addition to that, the infrastructure and availability of therapeutic and diagnostic capacity, waning political support in the face of declining disease incidence, maintaining motivation of officials, health workers, and affected populations in inadequate or delayed funding, and the need for donor commitment in the face of donor fatigue. Next slide, please. So generally, how do you overcome these majority of these challenges is what we're talking about, which we talked about yesterday and we'll be talking about more later today, is domestic financing advocacy, international financing advocacy, as well as strengthening of the infrastructure. The multi-sectoral coordination and approach, which Stefan also pointed out earlier today, and the importance of peace and health nexus. I mean, how do you reach these difficult to reach populations or hard to reach populations and have access to them? And we need to sort of focus on how we can actually reach these populations through conflict resolution, and some of the work that the Carter Center has actually done through our peace programs recently as well. The research for diagnostics and therapeutic development, operational research for programmatic implementation. I'm not going to go into detail because we heard a lot about surveillance and the frequency of MDAs and monitoring and evaluation, development of strategies for proactively planning and addressing challenges of climate change as well as environmental changes. Next slide, please. So most of the recent challenges for recurrent colysis or guinea worm are already sort of summarized nicely in this paper, which got recently published in the ASTMS journal. But they are to focus on animal host-driven transmission, political instability, the recent transmission in Angola, and some of the cross-border transmission happening at the border between Chad and Cameroon and CAR, the low human incidence and sustaining community engagement and funding, and again, the impact of climate change. Next slide, please. So how do you overcome some of these last mile challenges related to guinea worm? One health-driven research agenda, governmental and ministerial engagement, including tracking progress towards commitments. Last year we had an Abu Dhabi declaration where there were endemic countries which came up with a renewed commitment for guinea worm eradication, reinforcing country level and local partnership, strengthening cross-border surveillance and coordination, which is extremely important, in order to avoid some of the spillover in the bordering areas between endemic countries and non-endemic countries. Innovative community engagement approaches and the health system strengthening and cross-program collaboration. Next slide, please. So again, in river blindness, some of the majority of the things which I already outlined in the overall challenges are also outlined over here. Specifically, I also wanted to point out to some of the recent guidance on ongoing elimination mapping protocols and actually linking them to the evidence-based clarity from the WHO Onchocerciasis Technical Advisory Subgroup, which is very much needed. And in addition to that, the waning entomological expertise and building capacity for integrated vector management is important. And then again, dealing with vectors, you also have to keep in mind the challenges related to climate change. Next slide, please. Lymphatic filariasis, similar challenges, but supporting for scaling morbidity management and disability prevention and promoting integration with domestic health systems, cross-program collaboration, and specifically, as I pointed out yesterday, with the mental health programs on how to deal with the morbidity management and disability prevention for lymphatic filariasis. Threat for undetected transmission, despite meeting criteria for elimination as a public health problem and considering community-wide transmission status instead of only sampling the young children in the task surveys. Next slide, please. Schistosomiasis, very challenging. The technical limitations of eliminating transmission with existing tools and the need for investment in R&D. Feasibility of new elimination guidelines that were recently put out by WHO, developing implementation manuals for countries and programs are needed. The limited drug supply, which is a huge challenge, and how do we actually expand the drug donation program related to schistosomiasis and limited, again, donor enthusiasm. Next slide, please. Yeah, in trachoma, as we just heard a little bit about the surveillance and some of the progress that Paul just outlined, there are challenges related to persistent disease or the trachomatis inflammation, follicular recrudescence disease as well. In addition to that, finding the last TT cases, the trachomatis trichiasis, and the access and insecurity is a big challenge. Next slide, please. And the need for operational research, ongoing M&E requirement in all countries to eliminate trachoma follicular, and then alternative technologies, including the geospatial mapping, predictive methods, and access through the peace and health strategies for the populations that are difficult to access. So with that, I'm going to stop here and thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kashif. I want to thank all the speakers for packing an enormous amount of information into very condensed presentations. Believe it or not, we actually have some opportunity for questions here, and Dr. Sose gets the rights to the first comment.
Just because I'm close to the chair, it's not my right. But this is such a rich session. I don't want people to leave that thinking this is just a theoretical exercise. Everything presented by colleagues is very concrete, and we need to use it moving forward. But I would like to have Stefan, your slide number 3, while commenting broadly, so I can have some specific comment on that. We have heard across the presentation almost the same words, starting with the risk. And we look at the risk. Everybody talked about the risk. And you can see that population we are talking about are facing multiple risks. If you take the zero-dose polio, maybe it's a zero treatment NTD or the zero test. And if you take all those maps together, you can really see the real risk they are facing. They are multiple. And this justifies the integrated surveillance system, the zero surveillance into a functional integrated national surveillance system. Everything is interrelated. That's why also it's important for us as NTD in WHO not only to rely on our capacity for M&E, but we have a DDI division, a division dedicated to data, And thank you, Philip, for the presentation. We need to make sure that we use this capacity in-house, but also the work they do with external partners because they are not working alone together. When we had to do the excess mortality survey for COVID, we did it together, relying on strong network of partners. And we need really to think out of NTDs to build a real system and reliable data for impact. Paul, you talk about it. We need to be flexible and adapt our method. To give you an example on malaria, we started the World Malaria Report 2005. I was in that small group led by Bernard Nallen at that time. But today, when I look at the 2005 World Malaria Report, I even laugh because, the quality is very poor if you look at it today, because we managed to challenge the system. And working with Camry in Kenya from Afro, we managed WHO reporting system to get real population-based data and to demonstrate the changing risk of malaria in Africa, telling people you cannot do the same intervention everywhere, without taking into account the reality. This is the only way we can measure impact and adapt our intervention, not asking, mass administration everywhere all the time. And this is extremely important. And we have also seen the issue of humanitarian crisis and security from the polio, from Guinea worm, and our work with, colleagues working in health emergencies need really to take into account, as I said earlier, when we and partner work on the humanitarian response plan to take into account these specific risks, because it's not only about things they believe are humanitarian, but there are many other things we need to do together. And accountability, number of times at all levels. You cannot deal, Stefan, your slide number, number 3 from Stefan's presentation on the IHR and other. And accountability is critical, and we need to continue, challenging ourselves, challenging countries, accountability on the program we implement, accountability on, the supply system. And when we started the Global Fund, accountability was the main issue. We had to spend time to work in the first M&E toolkit for the Global Fund in 2005. And we convinced the Global Fund to allocate 5% of the budget to M&E, because in the first years between 2000 and 2005, the M&E was really weak and no culture of accountability from program manager, and it has completely changed. And we need the same for NTDs. And, the way also Alden presented accountability for polio is critical, and it's applied to all programs. And I'll come back to that for health security. The issue of denominator. I always say, immunization program, if you report 120% coverage, it can be 30% or 50% because you don't know your denominator. And we need to challenge the system. Many, many years ago, working at district level, I was obliged to organize my own census because I didn't trust the data from the national system, and I was right. Because when they base your performance on a very artificial population. Sometimes, this is based on some of electoral population, and they can be inflected in rural areas, for obvious reasons. If you don't have the proper census, a proper denominator, you will never be able to do proper monitoring and impact assessment. And for me, this is really critical. And challenging ourselves. This is well presented, on risk again. When I joined the health emergency program, there were so many checklists for preparedness with no risk assessment. I challenged the system to say, no, I want evidence-based preparedness. So what are we talking about? We had to go back to assess the real risk, mapping the risk of outbreak and emergencies in the African region before also proposing the joint external evaluations that really challenged WHO system, because it was self-assessment from WHO side, but we also have the US government with the global health security agenda. They wanted to do assessment. We met and proposed a joint external evaluation, which is a real accountability mechanism, independent, and followed by, national action plan, health security. So this need to be based on evidence and accountability. Otherwise, we can continue doing the same thing for many, many years without, being able to justify what we are doing. I think we need this real change. And when we proposed a joint external evaluation, it was a big discussion with member states here, World Health Assembly. And Tanzania was the first country volunteering to do the joint external evaluation and setting up the multi-sectoral partnership mechanism. And we had to present the GE at the parliament in Tanzania. And this is something we have published together with them. To tell you again that this multi-sectoral collaboration and coordination exists already for many programs. We talked about the IMR, now the health security and others. We can build on this to make sure that NTDs are properly reflected. In other countries, we can build on other existing mechanisms, but we are never starting from scratch. And coming back to the sustainability, again, we need to really invest on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sose. I think we have time for a couple of questions. I think I saw two right over here. Please.
I'm George Koaisi. I'm the Deputy Director in charge of malaria and NTD in Cameroon Ministry of Health. I will continue in French. Please keep your iPhone on. Just to establish a little language balance. If it's not for us, it's for the translators there qui doivent beaucoup s'ennuyer, les traducteurs du français à l'anglais. Ok, j'ai beaucoup apprécié la présentation de Philippe, mais je reste un peu sur ma faim parce que on est pour l'information pour l'action. Or, les moyens de dissémination ne sont pas très nombreux, enfin, dans la forme et dans le fond. Dans la forme, il faut engager les décideurs au plus haut niveau. Donc, on aimerait avoir l'information traduite sous une forme la plus simple, avec des indicateurs les plus simples. Les instances comme l'Assemblée mondiale, je sais pas, de l'OMS, où on a des ministres, parfois qui ne sont pas des techniciens, qui sont parfois des administrateurs, où on a des instances comme l'ONU, où on va engager d'autres forces, ou alors des instances comme la COP. Dès que vous commencez à parler trop technique, vous faites du bruit. Vous faites du bruit et le bruit n'entraîne pas une mobilisation en financement. Ils veulent voir des choses claires, une information simple, transmise le plus simplement possible. Souvent avec un petit code couleur qui suffit. On a vu ça avec Alma. Ceux qui connaissent un peu Alma, ils ont produit un document qu'on appelle la carte de score. Et c'est des histogrammes de couleurs avec des indicateurs simples. Ça fait que quand un ministre ou un président assiste à cette réunion, quand il rentre, vous savez qu'il a assisté à cette réunion. Parce que la couleur de l'indicateur qui n'est pas bon, vous le savez au plus bas de la pyramide. On vous dit, vous avez fait honte à votre président ou à votre ministre. Donc, c'est cette forme de dissémination qu'on veut davantage. Des indicateurs très simples avec des codes couleurs ou un histogramme qui peuvent engager la politique. Merci.
Yeah, thanks very much. Philippe, I think I need to give you an opportunity to respond if you wish.
Okay, thank you. So, I'll respond to part of your question, then I answer the one that's on the screen. So, the World Health Data Hub, the data.who.int dissemination system. So, one of the key things that's actually come up with your comment, votre commentaire en fait. Excusez-moi. Votre commentaire, puis le commentaire de plusieurs autres personnes dans les présentations, c'est que l'issue de la simplicité, la langue, c'est extrêmement important. Alors, une des choses qu'on a fait sur data.who.int, je ne sais pas si c'est possible de le mettre sur l'écran, mais en tout cas, je vais mettre le lien sur le slide, comme ça vous pouvez voir après. Mais la façon dont on a construit le système pour la dissémination, c'est vraiment pour tout simplifier. Alors, premièrement, tout est visuel. On a standardisé l'utilisation des couleurs. Comme ça, en fait, on a un peu de cette idée que quelque chose qui empire ou qui s'améliore peut changer avec des couleurs qui correspondent à ça, mais c'est standardisé pour tout le système. Alors, si on regarde pour un NTD ou si on regarde pour la malaria ou quelque chose d'autre, les couleurs ont toujours la même significance. Ensuite, pour les langues, sur data.who.int, si vous allez voir aujourd'hui, vous allez voir que tout ce qu'on a en fait dans les 6 langues officielles, non seulement ça, les templates qui sont utilisés pour montrer les données aussi sont localisés en fonction des langues. Alors, si vous regardez en arabe, par exemple, ça va aller de droite à gauche et c'est mis correctement. Comme ça, quelqu'un qui est habitué à lire dans une langue certaine va voir le contenu des données dans l'état où ils s'attendraient à voir ça dans leur langue. Alors ça, c'est les 2 gros trucs qu'on a fait. Et puis, c'est pas super immédiat quand on regarde sur data.who.int, mais aussi la façon dont on a construit le système, c'est que pour la dissémination sur Internet, c'est incroyablement léger. Alors, normalement, vous regardez une page sur un site de l'OMS, ça peut être entre 3 mégabytes, 20 mégabytes. Et pour ceux qui ne sont pas très techniques, ce sont des pages qui, en fait, ont un poids énorme. Alors, ce qu'on a fait pour data.who.int, c'est qu'on a simplifié la structure interne des pages, le code, le source code qui est utilisé pour les générer, pour que le poids de la page est très, très léger. Alors, comme ça, si vous êtes sur un téléphone mobile, si vous êtes sur un réseau qui n'est pas fiable, si ça vous coûte une fortune pour utiliser des données, comme c'est plus léger, c'est plus rapide, c'est moins cher, c'est plus facile à utiliser et ça prend moins de temps pour rentrer dans l'équipement que vous utilisez pour lire. Alors, pour la deuxième question, I'll switch to English because that one's in English. So support for ministries, data systems that feed into the WHDH. So it's a combination of things. So on the data exchange side, we make all the standards, APIs, everything publicly available, and we do everything standards based. So it's really easy to see what we expect and how to plug into it. For the most part right now, though, the World Health Data Hub isn't meant to directly reach out to a Ministry of Health and get data. So we still do that through our technical units, and they manage that process. So what we do is we help support that process. But because the WHDH is really meant to break down silos and be a collaboration platform also, not just with data, but how we deal with data, one of the things that we can facilitate is so I talked about smart guidelines, for an example, before. When smart guidelines are available for a particular disease area, if you're looking at the World Health Data Hub and you're looking at that particular disease, we can put linkages in that link to all these guidelines and all this supporting content. So it becomes a lot easier to find. And then also through the data exchange team, we do also provide technical support on demand for ministries of health to help modify and update information systems.
Yeah, thanks very much, Philippe. And with a great deal of regret and apologies for all of those who have your name placards in the vertical position. We're at the end of this portion of the session, and I'm afraid we're going to have to move on. I hope as you have questions, that you're going to be able to catch up with the speakers at lunch, recognizing that coffee breaks do not seem to be a thing for these 2 days. So with that, I'm going to move on to the next session and pass the baton to Yvon, who has a very full agenda as well, and will take us up to lunch. Yvon.
Thank you so much. I've received a suggestion, which is that we should have a bit of an exercise, right? And so I will ask you to all stand up and go through some sort of physical exercise that will be a way to live in our body the key messages to end NTDs by 2030. So it's going to be short, but I will ask you to stand up on your toes, go as high as possible for high-level advocacy. As high as you can. Very good. Now, I would like to ask you to lean forward as much as you can to reach the unreached, particularly the zero-dose communities that are a marker of the vulnerable. Next one, I want you to go down as low as possible to the lowest level of the health system. Everybody will hate me. It's not finished. It's not finished. And I will ask you to go as broad as possible for health system approach to ending NTDs. And maybe to hold hand with your neighbors, right? Thank you, thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
So thanks for bearing with us. And our mission, should you wish to accept it, is to try to have a session where we're gonna hear from a lot of different things and finish as close as possible to noon, or I'm told a bit after 12:15 if it's possible. So before, I would want to share a sort of a personal anecdote. As I've mentioned yesterday, I've had some experience in NTDs. My very first field work I was sharing with some colleagues with a field survey of trachoma in the prefecture of Sabou in Burkina Faso in 1991. I've also worked in Burkina Faso on validating the sensitivity of guinea worm surveillance back in 1992. I've worked on sleeping sickness in Uganda. I've worked also on leishmaniasis in India. One of my biggest pride also was in 1986, I was trained, I don't know if some people know him in the room, but I was trained by Dr. Gunnar Lomholt in Kamuzu Central Hospital of Lilongwe to be a mite hunter, because he said you couldn't diagnose scabies without objectifying the mite. So we had to go and look to all the burrows and extract the mite and check it in the microscope. So I've done a few NTD things, but I have a confession to make. I don't speak NTD language, and sometimes there are a number of acronyms or expressions that are being used that I don't understand. And I think what we're going to do today is to try to see how we can understand not NTD language, but the language of others, and how we could move forward the agenda of NTDs by understanding the way that others speaks and the way that other works. My wife is a teacher, and she says that there's this thing called the contrastive learning approach. You learn how to do things by looking at difference and how, and by understanding how differences can point to common patterns and solution. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our colleagues from health system, starting by Dr. Saeed, who will talk to us about universal health coverage for about, that's also your mission, should you wish to accept it, 5 minutes. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Ivan, and really a great privilege and a big thanks for this opportunity to share some thoughts actually on primary healthcare. I'm from the program on primary healthcare at WHO, and if I may just have just a few slides that will guide some of these discussions. So if you could kindly just put the slides on for me. First and foremost, I think all of us have heard about the need for radical reorientation of health systems towards primary healthcare that our Director General repeatedly emphasizes. In these just very short intervention moments, I'd like to just maybe put forward a few key concepts. Many of these concepts will be probably known to you, but we're laying that out, as Ivan has highlighted, to enhance the common language that we are using. So primary healthcare isn't new. It's been with us for many decades, but in the latest thinking on this one, our focus is primary healthcare as a systems approach, a whole of society approach to health that aims to maximize the level and equitable distribution of health and well-being. And it's important here to emphasize that primary healthcare is the pathway towards strong universal health coverage, but at the same time, health security hand in hand, and of course, healthier populations. So here the emphasis is on primary healthcare as an approach, health systems as a means, and UHC and the health-related SDGs as a goal. Next slide, please. Three components of primary healthcare, and often primary healthcare can be used interchangeably with primary care, and I'm just wanting to emphasize the differences between primary healthcare as an approach and primary care as a level of care. Three components of primary healthcare that have a very strong linkage with NTDs. First, multi-sectorality, policy and action that spans beyond the health sector into other parts of government. So that multi-sectorality piece being critical. Second, empowered people and communities. Just listening in this morning, it's very clear that this is critical from the NTD lens, and it's critical to the primary healthcare approach. Third, services. So integrated health services with an emphasis on primary care as the first point of contact with the health system, but ensuring strong linkages with public health functions. This is the essence of that integrated health services that then is built on through multi-sectorality and empowerment. Next slide. So those are principles, but how do we operationalize that? WHO and UNICEF have released a framework of action for primary healthcare, which provides a clear theory of change linking the approach that I've just described, levers for action, and results. So here, the importance is placed on 14 interdependent levers that clearly articulate actions and interventions that are required to accelerate progress. And each of these levers, importantly, are interdependent. So and perhaps I'll just maybe highlight a few of those levers, just using one as an example. You can see that there is 4 strategic levers and 10 operational levers. One of those strategic levers is focusing in on political commitment to primary healthcare. Here, the linkage with NTDs becomes critically important. That political commitment to NTDs as part of a sustainable approach to primary healthcare. An example of an operational lever, systems for improving quality of care. So where we are talking about point of care, organizing for quality of care at subnational level, but also setting national strategic direction on quality of care. But these are not seen as isolated parts of primary healthcare, but they're seen as interdependent parts of primary healthcare. 5 minutes is fastly whittling by, but I would like to make one point of emphasis building on the point that Paul was mentioning from the task force related to the driver for primary healthcare. And in fact, the Task Force for Global Health and WHO have been examining the effect and role of compassion in building and the engine for primary healthcare. Those are a few points in the 5 minutes, Ivan. Over.
Thank you so much. If you allow me a follow-up question, I used to work in the Global Hepatitis Program, and I was a program person also, and I was approached by the health system group to engage in the compendium of intervention, where we were asked to reformulate what we understood as a big guideline into a sort of database format. If you had a one-line elevator speech advocacy message for our colleagues in NTDs and how they would gain from engaging in the compendium, engaging in Speedy, and engaging in that approach, what would it be?
Yeah. So here, the critical importance, I think colleagues in this room will recognize the critical importance of packages of health services. And a clearly defined package of health services is, of course, fundamental to universal health coverage. The implementation of that package of health services is really can be strengthened in a sustainable way through implementing a primary healthcare approach. That would be my point.
So that's basically putting it into the DNA of the health system rather than as an external intervention or something that's perceived as ad hoc. Thank you so much. Now it's going to be my pleasure to introduce Susan. I was trying to find where you were. So Susan and I, we've worked so much, and in the same way that when I was in hepatitis, I learned so much from the compendium. I engaged also with Susan and health financing and also with the team working on the UHC price tag. And I remember when Susan said, Yvonne, never talk about raising revenue without improving efficiency at the same time. And Susan has a lot of experience in this activity called the cross-programmatic efficiency analysis, where we look at all the different vertical programs, like the one funding by Gavi Global Fund, and how we could increase the synergy also sometime to the benefit of other programs such as NTD. So Susan, from all your wisdom and your practical experience, what is there to learn for NTDs to improve the financing and make sure that these interventions are implemented? Over to you in 5 minutes.
Of course, thanks, Yvonne. And just to say, I had the pleasure of working on the NTD sustainability framework. And so it's really lovely to see some colleagues in person here. And again, I'm coming from the economist perspective here. So just to put that out out front. So the first message, I think, on this question of what are some of the lessons that we see from other programs, other initiatives, but most importantly from the domestic health budgeting perspective in relation to this question of what does it mean to sustainably finance for neglected tropical disease coverage. And so the first point is here, the be realistic part. And so just a sobering figure as we're putting together the global monitoring report on UHC right now. And just to say, from a low income country on average, so the debt servicing share of the overall general government expenditure between 2010 and 2019 was around 5.6%. So the amount of money governments are having to pay annually to service their debt. This is low income countries. In 2023, that's now 8.8%. And so during COVID, we did see massive increases in public financing for health, but they were largely financed by deficit spending. And so just being cognizant of that overall dialogue with ministries of finance, and I'm glad that that's been put on the table here in terms of how do we match costs to economic realities. And I know there's often a rush to think about the costs associated with the incredibly important coverage targets, but how to engage in that dialogue with Ministry of Finance, but also in a joined up way across Ministry of Health colleagues to increase the overall size of health spending along with spending for NTDs. And so, and the colleague from Tanzania put it very well here on the second point of what does it mean to take a domestic budgeting perspective? If we are all behind this notion that the key to sustainability is domestic public funding. And so one thing is budget advocacy, and yes, that's important. But another thing is really understanding where does that budget need to go? Who's making the decisions in the system in terms of allocation? Is it really at the national level, or is it, as the colleague from Tanzania stressed, it's the subnational level? And who's making those decisions, and how do you engage with where those budgets actually need to sit in a much more nuanced way? So really getting beyond the idea of funding and actually the financing mechanisms. And then as Sham said, this issue on being strategic. And so what we see in terms of this global direction of travel, especially because I do work a lot with the HIV, TB, malaria, EPI related space related to global funding, Gavi, is PHC as the rallying cry, as the really the rallying cry to bring all of this programmatic interventions together, this notion of people-centered care, and how can NTDs use that moment? So we know there are fiscal space constraints, but there are huge opportunities to be at the table, to be advocating from a service package, from a service delivery perspective. And so we often reflect in the financing space that it seems as though the long tail of MDG thinking of we need money for specific diseases, which is super important, but also what does it mean to have those system foundations, and how do we make sure those are financed? And so how can NTDs really be at the table as part of those discussions in a joined up way? And also in a realistic way. And then this third point is being flexible. And the colleagues again from Senegal and Tanzania, I think were the excellent, provided excellent examples and far more specific than I can in these 5 minutes. But really understanding, so, and when we talk to Ministry of Health colleagues, either from a programmatic perspective or from a broader planning perspective, is this frustration over overly earmarked tight funding, and how to actually, so if we're moving in this direction of travel towards primary health care, how can we enable the flexibilities that are needed for that joined up care while prioritizing the accountability for results? And so some of this, this is some of the direction of travel also in terms of the PFM lessons, the public financial management lessons from COVID, is this need for flexible allocation of funding within the health sector, but with strong accountabilities. And finally, my last point, we've done a lot of work looking at donor transition experiences. And what we see as a concrete point is that those services that are previously externally financed, that when they become domestically financed, that a key factor in that process relates to the alignment and integration of very specific functions. And so one point that comes up very clearly across countries is the importance of, even if commodities are funded externally, running them through the domestic supply chains where that procurement capacity sits is really essential. And so how, as the NTDs, as this community moves forward and really thinks about the sustainability framework, really getting to the heart of where do those capacities need to sit? If you do the counterfactual, if the external assistance is not there, where would those capacities need to sit and who would they need to be funded by? And doing that ex ante as a way to really embed the sustainability, but also the efficiency principles. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Susan. So if I understand you correctly, with all this amount of money and resources and attention given in supply chain management with Gavi Global Fund, we can be a sort of way and take opportunities of this and ask if we can just put a little box at the top of the four-wheel drive and also get there. Thank you so much. So now we've gone through the first part of the conversation around providing health and UHC. And now it will be my pleasure to introduce Dr. Chikwe, who is ADG in the WHO Health Emergency Program. And we hope that he is connected and that somehow his voice will come through, because he is probably, I don't know where, in Berlin or somewhere else on the planet. Chikwe, can you hear us?
Hi, Ivan. I can hear you loud and clear. Can you hear me?
Wonderful to have you. So I have a question for you, Chikwe, and I don't know if you're able to load your slide or if you want to speak without slide. Did you receive slides?
I
No.
did have a few slides, but happy to take questions, whatever way you want to run with this.
Okay, so it seems it's not my... can you be closer to the microphone, Chikwe? I'm hearing that you're not so... Your voice
Yes,
doesn't come
I
across.
said I have a couple of slides, but I'm happy to run without as well.
Okay, so let's check if the team has the capacity to offer you to share directly the slides. If you were... Yes, you should be able now, I'm told by Farah. So the question while you're loading is how NTDs can work, approach emergency programs to maximize synergies in emergency preparedness, response, and recovery? How can we improve our partnership? How can we ensure service continuity in emergencies? Over to you, Chikwe, in 5 minutes if you can. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivan. Thanks, thanks, colleagues. In 5 minutes, I had two approaches possible to try and cover the whole of health emergency preparedness and response, which wouldn't be possible. So I decided to pick up one aspect of it and use it as an illustration of where I hope we are going to go to over the next few years. But I've listened into a lot of the sessions already. On the side of what I was doing. And it's almost, my presentation is almost redundant because I'm really excited about the use of words like integration, collaboration. It's as if there's a moment where we've all come to realize how much we really have to force this working together. So we have come up with in the HEPR, there's a new framework for health emergency preparedness and response that contains something called the 5 Cs, but I'll focus on the collaborative surveillance just to illustrate what we're trying to do. And this slide you'll all see is really an illustration of all the data points that we had to acknowledge and use in the response to the pandemic that we're kind of just coming out of. And anyone working in this space will realize that we've had to do this over the past 50 years anyway. But the pandemic offered us an opportunity to become acutely aware that just counting incident cases and deaths and a little bit of morbidity, as was done by most of us that were involved in surveillance to some extent or the other, was simply insufficient for our leaders to have the information that they needed to manage the response. And therefore, it became clear to all of us that we have to be a lot more systematic in accessing all the various other data points, some within the health system, others outside of the health system, that we need to make the decisions that we need to make, especially when we need to make them in an acutely, timely, and flexible way. And in a way, I don't really personally see the big difference between NTDs and infectious diseases that we work in the emergency program, other than the need for speed. If you take away that simple variable, most of the thinking that we're doing right now should actually be applicable across board. And apart from leading the new hub in Berlin, I'm also leading a new division in the emergencies program for surveillance and health emergency intelligence systems. But my role really will be to reaching out across the organization to see how we can pull our work together. So this is the thinking that we're doing in the surveillance space, and that I think will be relevant for all of us working on NTDs as well. Not forcing integration, but really thinking about it as collaboration. And in this slide, you can see the various boxes that relate to activities in the health sector, animal and environment, but also across the vertical disease programs. This recognizes that these boxes exist already in most countries. And to force the boxes together into an integrated model will probably take a few more decades. So the issue is not, are we using one system for all the diseases? The question is, how well are we using our human resources, our technology, our labs, and coming from someone that has worked mostly in developing country settings, we cannot afford to have a lab for onchocerciasis only, as we have in Nigeria, one context I know very well. We have to integrate the scarce resources that we have to provide the baseline infrastructure, baseline human resources that we need to respond to all infectious diseases, whether the NTDs or whether the diseases led on by the emergencies program. And I don't think there's ever been a moment in time that we can push harder on this. And this is really what we're trying to do. So we have a new vision for disease surveillance, published a paper on it just before the World Health Assembly, accompanied by an editorial in the Lancet that really is thinking about how do we operationalize this in every country, in every subsystem, around using data systems that we have, information systems for all diseases or as many diseases as we want to, integrating capacity. So if you have analytical capacity, it's able to serve all the threats that you're thinking about, and having an open, honest, and sometimes single mode of communicating these because they all relate to each other. This is ambitious. This has a lot of risk associated with it because we have defined the way we work globally in these vertical systems. We know we cannot integrate locally. So the midpoint, at least, is how do we ensure that at the intersections, we find a way of collaborating across the resources that we have. And the final concept, Ivan, I wanted to share with this group is that over the past 3 decades, we have focused, all of us collectively, on the vertical axis on this graph. We have focused on building capacity, whether it's human resources, whether it's technology, whether it's institutions. But the key finding for many of us out of this pandemic is that capacity is not enough. We have to put as much effort, if not more, in the collaboration and collaborating across the various dimensions, across the disease areas, across diseases, across the One Health sectors, across the event life cycle, and across geographies. If we don't get better at this, and if we don't put resource and accountability frameworks on the collaboration aspect, it will continue to be on our wish list. So what we are trying to do in the emergencies program, which I also hope the NTD side of the house will pick up, and we will work on this together, is to hold ourselves accountable for the collaboration. And that's something we are trying to do now. You can see this illustration, and this is the last slide, of a rope, and across the dimensions that we are hoping that we can collaborate across. And the symbolism of the rope is that, of course, it's stronger the more we tie it together. So if we tie together the work we're doing across diseases, across the sectors, across the event life cycle, and across geographies, we will be in a much stronger position to make better decisions, which I think is a collective wish for everyone in this room today, everyone listening virtually, and really the hope for all of us as we move forward. Of course, this will be enabled by the government financing, trust, and build. But this is our vision for the future. And whether we're talking about surveillance, in this case, I could make exactly the same presentation on countermeasures, for instance, on community service, community protection, on clinical services. We have to think really about how we bring these together so we can end up stronger together as we work with the communities and the countries that we serve. So Ivan, thanks. I'll pause here, stop sharing, and of course, take any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chikwe. So we're trying to go through all the panelists, so I hope you can stay with us. Will you be able to stay with us until noon in case we have questions?
I will be.
That's really wonderful. So then we will move to the next area after providing health and protecting health. We move to promoting health. And it'll be my pleasure to ask Sophie Boisson, and who is right in front of me. So Sophie, working in a WASH perspective, how can we work together to make sure that all the WASH interventions that are needed for NTDs are implemented? Over to you in 5 minutes if you can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to be with the NTD community today. I just wanted to share some insights from and reflections on some of the work that we've been doing with the NTD community over the last 8 years or so. So of course, nobody in this room needs to be convinced of the importance of adequate water sanitation and hygiene for disease prevention, including obviously neglected tropical diseases. Whether we talk about sanitation to prevent contamination of the environment, water resource management, wastewater and solid waste management for vector control, but also clean water and hygienic condition in home and at healthcare facilities to manage the morbidity associated with these diseases. From the WASH perspective, although we've made great progress over the past decades, we're largely off track to meet the SDG targets. And in fact, we would need at least 4 times the current rates of progress to meet those targets. And we see that much faster progress are needed in fragile contexts and the least developed countries. We also see that there's huge disparities in access to WASH within countries. And we clearly see from the data that rural areas remains largely underserved. We know that populations that do not have access to these basic essential services are the ones that are most exposed and most likely to suffer from a multitude of diseases, so including NTDs. So from the WASH community, as you may have heard, obviously there was the UN Water Conference in March this year, which was the first conference of its kind in about 50 years, and which really aimed to mobilize action on WASH to reach universal access by 2030. So there's a clear need to really improve the targeting of WASH investment to those that are in needs and improve equity. So as I mentioned, we've been collaborating with the NTD community for the past 8 years now. And the 2030 NTD roadmap clearly acknowledged the importance of WASH for NTD control, elimination, and eradication by including a cross-cutting target on WASH. And this was accompanied by a global strategy on WASH and NTDs that was first published in 2015, but updated with the publication of the roadmap, and which provides a framework for collaboration around 4 main areas: around raising awareness, around the use of WASH and NTD data to highlight inequalities and target investments, but also sharing evidence on best practices on what works and what doesn't work in terms of integrated approaches, but also providing some guidance on how to jointly plan, deliver, and evaluate programs. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give a quick update on some of this work over the last few years. So far, engagement of WASH and NTDs has continued at global level, but also in countries. And we've heard earlier this morning that many countries have established technical working groups and that have provided forums for standing collaboration. WHO has worked closely with partners, including partners from the NNN, and we released the second edition of an interactive toolkit that provides practical guidance on how the WASH and the NTD sector can collaborate on the ground. And it has since been used in more than 15 countries. One area that is better reflected now with the second edition is really around the use of WASH and NTD data and how these 2 types of data set can be brought together to inform decision making and really identify high priority area where WASH access is low and where NTD endemicity is high. Some example of this work is the inclusion of WASH in the ESPEN portal, where you have some visualization tools looking at WASH and NTD data to inform decision making. We've seen also great example of in countries of coordination, both at the national level, but also developing training and cascading coordination down to region and district level. For example, in Ethiopia has been a great example, and we've seen that those efforts have led to stronger connection with the One WASH national program. but also where we've seen budget allocation for WASH activities and infrastructure in some of the high endemicity districts. So I just wanted also to reflect on some of the challenges when we talk about multi-sectoral coordination. Often, we tend to see that there's a high level of complexity associated with it. So I think it's good to remind ourselves that we need to identify clear entry points for collaboration. It was mentioned earlier, taking advantage of existing platforms where on WASH and health, for example, joint sector reviews in countries where NTDs and WASH actors can come together, but also simple entry points, maybe situation analysis. They could be simple behavior change interventions being included in the MDA campaigns, for example. And all that is really critical. It's really critical to have flexible funding mechanisms that allow to align different program streams and better support implementations. So in this, really, partners play a key role in generating examples and models of collaboration, but also encouraging sharing of experience and good practices, but also capacity building. So with that, I will stop, and thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Sophie. And Nina, to get back to my list of questions, the next panelist is Mark Booth from the University of Newcastle. And during the preparation of the session, he was underlining the capacity to be anticipating the changes that are going to happen over the years with the distribution of NTDs and how we need to be ready for this. So over to you, Mark, in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I just want to draw attention to what I'm wearing. I'm wearing red today, not because it suits my Anglo-Irish Nordic complexion, lightly tanned, but to really highlight the dangers of being complacent about the link between climate change and NTDs. Climate change is not just another risk factor. It is more than that. It is an agent of change to be reckoned with. Okay, that's the end of the activism. Now we get to the science. Thank you. Okay, first slide, please. Okay, there are many possible futures. This is a slide I use very often in my lectures on climate change, and I think it's very potent in the way it displays the uncertainty that is being created by anthropogenic factors that create climate change. Here we see some simulations of emissions through to 2100, and that fan that you see in that picture shows really that we don't know where we're heading. And the future is uncertain from tomorrow onwards. Really, we can't say what's going to happen. No one has that crystal ball to tell us where we're going to be in 5, 10, 15, or 100 years. We could be anywhere on that graph, depending on policies of government, how the world develops, how systems work or don't work, how populations grow, don't grow, etc., etc. Now, given that uncertainty, how can we be sure that anything that we think might happen will happen? We really can't be that certain. So any estimate, and I'm looking at the costing team here, how would you go about costing climate change? I don't know, maybe we can have a conversation. But really, I think there needs to be an overarchingly new way of thinking about how to deal with an uncertain future. Next slide, please. Now, it's particularly important for NTDs because of the non-linearity effects of climate change. We can think of the world getting warmer, but the impact of that warming of the world will be very non-linear. Here we see some data from experiments on insects and snails that are the vectors of several NTDs. And you can see that in all those graphs, I've just overlaid them on each other because you can see the generalizable pattern, which is a kind of parabolic or U-shaped curve. And that is how these vectors and intermediate hosts respond to changes in temperature. You can see on each axis, on the x-axis, I hope you can see the details, there is some measurement of temperature. And then on the y-axis, there's some measure of the life history parameters of that organism. And it's either reproductive ability or longevity. And there is always, nearly always, an optimal temperature beyond which or below which the parasite won't, or the vector won't thrive, and above which the parasite, this could apply to eggs, for example, of the parasite in soil, beyond which the parasite can't survive. And there's an optimum temperature. So some areas are currently too cold, the soil or the water is too cold, and it will warm up as a result of global warming, and then the parasite or the vector will thrive. But at some point, there will be a tipping point, and it will be the habitat will no longer be suitable, and the population will crash. And we know this is true because we've seen it happen in natural populations that have been affected on a seasonal basis, and it's to do with maintaining energy flows. At low temperatures, the vector or the parasite doesn't have sufficient energy to thrive, and at higher temperatures, it has to limit the amount of energy it uses, put the brakes on because they are not endotherms. So what might happen in the real world is that some areas that are currently too cold may become suitable for transmission as the world warms up, and some areas currently suitable may become unsuitable. And so there may be an accelerated effect of climate change towards elimination or eradication in the local areas. Next slide, please. But at the moment, we're definitely in that warming phase where certain areas are becoming more habitable, and we can see the evidence of that. The top graph on the right-hand side is dengue cases in Brazil. You can see there's been a massive uplift in the numbers over recent years. That's been partly attributed to urbanization, which of course is also a downstream effect of climate change. As certain habitats become unsuitable, people will move into urbanized areas. And the bottom panel is a series of headlines. They're just pasted from articles that have reported cases through migration or local epidemics of schistosomiasis in different areas, one of which was in Corsica in France a few years ago, and that was barcoded. The genes of the parasite were barcoded, and we know that the person or persons that brought that infection into Corsica came from Niger. So there's going to be temperature changes, urbanization changes, other social system changes. Some of this is about migration. Next slide, please. This is a map I published years ago. It's based on data from another paper, but I just graphed it for visual impact. You can see that there are a number of routes out of West Africa. These are migration routes that have been attributed to the climate crisis. So people have moved because their habitats have become unsuitable, and people from West Africa have moved across the Atlantic. They've moved into Europe, and there's evidence that I think this really demonstrates how easily it's possible for people to move and bring their infections to other countries. And the evidence is that epidemics can start as a result of those introductions. Next slide, please. So what can we do about it? Well, I think the good news is that climate change is not such a bogeyman that we just can't do anything about it. We're not tasking this room to solve climate change, but I think some of the solutions are certainly in line with what else has been suggested. There needs to be improvements in collaboration, wider participation. There needs to be a greater level of awareness, as I said yesterday, a greater level of knowledge in all sectors. And I previously said that I think, and I've heard this elsewhere in other contexts, that there should be more of an independent body that is tasked with holding the resources. And we heard a lot this morning from Mr. Boucher about the data hub in WHO. Maybe this can help. But is dedicated to climate change and NTDs. And that new body could be created and tasked with creating awareness, training, education, operational and basic research and surveillance. I will again emphasize the value of research here because there's a lot of unknowns. Next slide, please. And again, I think surveillance, integrated surveillance, and combine that with adaptive decision-making tools will also be necessary. And the reason for adaptive decision tools is because there's going to be a lot of different contexts that have to be addressed. We can't just assume that the same approach is going to work everywhere. And there's been many gains, and we've heard them already, many successes. And the current roadmap does have a lot of objectives that could be reached with current methodologies. However, I think the danger is that if it's the last mile or if we're looking into the future, there may well need to be more flexibility built into any program. And it's about having a conversation about climate change. We heard, well, Ellen yesterday said, who is a fundraiser? Well, I could say, who's a climate activist? And you could be an activist without going out onto the streets or doing anything too drastic and direct action. You could be an activist within your organization who always puts your hand up and says, well, what are we doing about climate change and NTDs? Is anybody thinking about it? And if you're not, then think about it, because it may well be the case that in your area, within your constituency, there is anxiety, there is a lack of awareness and a lack of knowledge, And it may be that you do nothing. You can make that choice to do nothing, but in some cases you might need to do something. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I think the fact is that climate crisis is creating uncertainty regarding the where and when of transmission. We have evidence from modeling, we have evidence from case studies and epidemics. New foci are emerging, but some existing foci will disappear. I think current projections on elimination and eradication may need significant rethinking, particularly into future decades, and low awareness and prioritizing of the issue. It's quite lonely where I am, being an NTD climate NTD specialist. So low awareness and prioritizing of the issue among stakeholders does, I think, require significant uplifting, and improved decision support tools that can make flexible decisions based on local contextualized issues. They can lead to improved mitigation or adaptation to the climate crisis as necessary. And finally, I would reiterate, I think an independent global observatory could help develop an open access resource to anxious stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And now we will move to Graham Alabaster, who is from UN Habitat. So Graham, how can we work with UN Habitat and identify collaborations in the field of migration and urbanization? If you can, in 5 minutes, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair, and we're delighted to be here at this meeting, but as a long-term partner with WHO. My first sort of point really is that urban comes in all shapes and sizes, and of course in designing health interventions, the one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. Migration is of course connected to urbanization, climate, and of course conflict. And depending on where you are in the world, that urbanization characteristic and how it moves forward depends on, you know, the communities. But of course, what happens is when you get the migration in urban settings, there's increased pressure on services, not just health services, but also particularly access to basic infrastructure. And of course, you start to get very dense urban settlements. But, you know, urban settings are very complex. Even smaller urban centers, where most of the urbanization is going ahead in some parts of the world, they have this constant sort of difficulty and challenge with governance. Can I have the next slide, please? The important point, of course, of many urban centres is that they all have peri-urban settlements. The way these peri-urban settlements are expanding, I mean, everyone's heard the statistic that urban centres are expanding, and we already live in a majority urban world, but this is going to increase up to 2050. But the most important statistic is that 60% of the urban areas that will exist in 2050 have yet to be built. And this presents a unique opportunity for us who are interested in managing diseases, particularly through environmental means, but also other more conventional treatments, and how we understand that. So we've got two opportunities here. We have something we have to propose to deal with immediate crisis and disease outbreaks, but then also we've got this longer term opportunity to influence the urban design to try and design out some of these diseases. City leaders and civic leaders are very important in this process because, of course, they can have a direct impact on the form and function of these urban settings. But perhaps more importantly, they have this very important role to play between the national government, the ministries of health and other ministries, and the communities that they serve. And it's only if they're functioning effectively that we can get the optimum contributions from communities. The other thing is that many of these, if you like looking at the environmental determinants in urban settings, yes, they will impact on neglected tropical diseases, vector-borne diseases, but they will also impact on other diseases as well, including non-communicable diseases. Next slide, please. So the most vulnerable urban settlements, in most places where the peri-urban settlements exist in cities, there's this complex juxtaposition between the slum dwellers, the low-income communities, and the higher income settlements they serve. This may be that there are, you know, the poor live near their place of work, It may mean that they are domestic communities who are serving, high-income households. But it's very important that we understand this very complex relationship between the peri-urban and the urban. And of course, if we can't manage the health status in these poor communities, it directly impacts on the more wealthy areas of the city. But of course, the demographies change and the treatment seeking behaviors change wherever you are in the world. The other good thing about urban and urban leaders is that they understand the idea of resilience because they've been used to managing environmental threats or in other areas. Next slide, please. So how do we sell this idea to cities? I mean, really, the city-led approach is very important. But most importantly is that we need to understand that this isn't about coming up with new tools. It's about using existing tools in different urban contexts. It can be sold and the city leaders can be convinced because there are huge economic gains to be made by reducing neglected tropical diseases. They understand, of course, the importance of environmental modification, but they also understand the important need to combine these environmental control methods with other more conventional treatment practices. So the idea of a city-led approach, but working with the larger community, involving them in surveillance and monitoring is very, very important. Next slide, please. In practice, this means that we need to, as mentioned by previous speakers, have much more data and information that is spatially referenced. So we understand how this complex urban setting can be understood, and we can use that information and data to make local level management decisions. And again, the idea you can work on pilots, both from the point of view of quick wins and dealing with immediate health outbreaks, but also this long-term planning. There are many opportunities once these models have worked to institutionalize them in the local setting. And also these structures that you set up, these governance structures, can also be useful to address some of the more thorny issues like corruption and other issues which of course relate to the many situations and provision of healthcare. Next slide, please. We did, in fact, back in late 2021, between WHO and UN Habitat, launch the Healthy Cities, Healthy People initiative. And this is not a new network, but the idea is to focus the work that we do together on neglected tropical diseases and vector-borne diseases. This is about an advocacy approach. This is getting mayors and city leaders to embrace this concept. We've had many cities who've signed up. We're in the process of looking for more resources to develop this further, but we have taken some ideas about what this should look like and consulted with some cities already about what we could do. The next slide, please. And it looks something like this. On the top layer, you have the national government level work in identifying both domestic and external funding to support projects. And underneath, you have this iterative structure of how cities can identify neighborhoods, develop pilots, and incorporate those into larger scale funding. This is frequently a way we find in other sectors how we can use pilot activities in urban areas to nudge and to push larger scale funding opportunities in the longer term. And the next slide, please. And just this is my final slide. In terms of our takeaways and our work from urban settings, it's really critical that we understand the diversity of urban and we address our interventions of different cities of different sizes. Mayors and city leaders need to be encouraged to think on a two-track approach, both short-term responses and long-term, and rethinking urban design principles. There's a great opportunity to unlock community potential further for surveillance, innovation, education, and also the concept can be sold based on multiple long-term co-benefits. And well, of course, the key to this is finding ways to start catalytic funding at the local level to kickstart this long-term change. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Graham. And we will close with Junxia Song from the FAO in Rome. And if you allow me to share, Junxia, I think yesterday, really, Junxia shared a speck of gold of an idea. One of the beauty working in my position with all kind of communicable diseases, I touched on so many fields. And the field of antimicrobial resistance, there's this fantastic idea called the Multi-Partner Trust Fund. And Junxia was saying, in fact, Ivan, what we need is just develop the same mechanism for NTD. And that is the best way to plan and work together. So I thought that was a fantastic idea that you had. So over to you for this idea and any other fantastic idea that you have to move forward on One Health and NTDs.
Thank you very much, Ivan, and good morning, colleagues. I'm very grateful to be part of this discussion to share some perspective from One Health side. So on the slides, this picture, I take it from the One Health definition that was developed by the One Health high-level panel. Actually, One Health is not something new, but the COVID pandemic really reiterates how One Health is important to address these complex health challenges. So by recognizing the linkages of human health, animal health, and the environment health, so the One Health approach can provide a more comprehensive and holistic perspective to better understand the drivers, to address the health issues. And One Health really emphasized the collaboration and cooperation across disciplines, sectors, and institutions. So One Health could leverage diverse perspectives, knowledge, and resources to develop more effective strategies and solutions. And also, the One Health recognized the potential disease originated from animal or wildlife. So it is important to prevent upstreams rather than waiting for humans to be infected. This approach is particularly relevant to many of the NTDs. So One Health is also recognized the health environment of the well-being of human, animal, and ecosystem, considering the environment factors such as climate change, shared a lot of insights by Mark, and habitat preservation and pollution. So the integration of human, animal, and the environment health through One Health approach can really improve the health outcomes. So next slide, please. The quadripartite, namely WHO, FAO, WOHA, and UNEP, developed this One Health joint plan of action. So it aims to prevent the future health threats and promote the health in the way of sustainable to really address the health issue in a collective effort. So the One Health joint plan of action is structured in 6 action tracks. So on the slides, you can see NTD was included in the action track 3. Action track 1 is the One Health capacities to strengthening health systems. Number 2 is reduce the risks from emerging and re-emerging zoonotic endemics and pandemics. Number 3 is NTDs, endemic zoonotic disease, and also vector-borne diseases. Number 4 is strengthening assessment, management, community of food safety. So number 5 is curbing the silent pandemic we mentioned yesterday, antimicrobial resistance. Number 6 is the environment of One Health. So One Health joint plan of action is really linked with NTD with all the different health threats, including the emerging internal food safety, antimicrobial resistance, and climate change and health environment. So in terms of action track 3, the objective is to really reduce the burden of endemic zoonotic disease, neglected diseases by supporting the countries implementing at the country level, community-centered, risk-based solution, and strengthening policy legal frameworks from the local to regional and global level, and across the sectors, increasing the political commitment and investment. Next slide, please. I feel we work with WHO and WOHA to address NTD, we have for decades. For example, we already since 1997, FAO work with WHO to address trypanosomosis in Africa, covering almost 30 of the countries. So we are here, we are from FAO, we support from animal health side, from agri-food systems perspective. And another example is rabies. Rabies is really another flagship program between WHO, FAO, WOHA, and also together in collaboration with GARC, the United Against Rabies was established, the forum, and it really bring together all the stakeholders and to address rabies and through a multi-sectoral and One Health approach. It's now more and more recognized by the countries. Last year, UAR provided really collective support and to address rabies in Burkina Faso, to coordinate the vaccines. And also the UAR forum get more and more requests from the countries and to address this rabies through this One Health approach. So, but the NTDs, as indicated in the One Health Joint Plan of Action, NTDs is closely linked with other threats. But since COVID, we can see more and more attention has been shifted to pandemic, to emerging diseases. So we really need more attention to be focused on NTDs. We cannot have separate health system between pandemic diseases and endemic. There has to be integrated. And in many, One Health now is really on high agenda in many high political events. For example, yesterday, one colleague mentioned the UNGA this year, September, the declaration, and also G7, G20. One Health is really on the core agenda. So how to integrate it, how to advocate NTDs in this One Health agenda. And this is really could play a very important role, not only at global level, and also can help translate all this One Health plans, strategies into action at country level. At the country level, and one thing I just want to highlight is we really need to establish a One Health platform. It's also to address NTD, but also to cover all One Health, including yesterday mentioned the AMR as part of it could be also drive this One Health platform at the country level. So that's the point. Recently, there is a big funds, it's pandemic funds, initiated jointly by World Bank and WHO. So, and FAO as an implementing entity, we try to support the countries to integrate it, the One Health threats into pandemic funds. So NTD could be included in this one pandemic funds. So this fund is really to prepare for PPR, prevention, preparedness, and response. It's not only for pandemic, it should be also for endemic diseases. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'll be looking for guidance in terms of what time we should put the hard stop, 12 or 12:15. 15? Yes, huh? Okay, so let's try to give ourselves until 12:15. So I'm back to my question. Do you speak NTDs? We've seen, I think, presentation that came from very different backgrounds, some concept about health systems, the concept of health financing, the whole vision of collaborative surveillance, and all these things that we've seen on multi-sectoral action. So one option for advocacy is to try to educate the whole world about the NTD acronyms or language. The other approach is to try to speak the language of today's public health, which could be our best chance at that collective action. And I think what we've seen is all about the 3 billions and also the SDG. And I would like to maybe kick off the conversation along those lines. How could we
learn each other tricks, and work with the perspective of the partners in mind for collective action. So I'd like to open the room for common question in that perspective. Julie.
Yes, thank you. I have been really inspired by both the session before this and this session because, and I have to say I was concerned in coming to the first new partners meeting that we would be hearing the same conversation, and we're not. And I think that it seemed the path that we were on is that we would ever increasingly have more and more diseases clamoring to be an NTD. And we go from this list of 10 to 20, and then it's ever expanding with these things that are being left behind. And that cannot be the path to sustainability to make this actually work. And what it shows is that we're not doing our day job of providing the services to people that need them. And so we know that if there's UHC, if there's WASH, if we have One Health, if we have surveillance data and we're able to respond to outbreaks, the NTDs are not going to be a problem, right? They're going to be taken care of. And so this conversation that we're having here right now is so inspiring because it's changing the dialogue to actually using all of the efforts. We're not alone. It felt like in NTDs we were very alone, and we're not. Everybody's doing this work and there's a way to come together. So I want to see this plan actually put into action and to see this direction moving forward. And I don't have the answers, but I'm very excited to be on this journey. So, and this will allow us to be nimble enough to adapt to the new environment of climate change, of unrest, of urbanization. So I think there's a pathway here that's being laid out for us, and voices of people actually being at the table, telling us different things, introducing us to new acronyms, accusing us of using too many, which we do. We have acronyms of acronyms in the NTD world, which is really amazing. I look forward to seeing how we can turn this into reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In the meantime, I got a message from Mission Control that as much as maybe we want to extend beyond noon, we need to make sure that the interpreters are with us on board. So colleagues upstairs, I'm not sure if I can see you. If you could let us know if you're okay to continue beyond 12 or not, or if it's a hard stop, kindly send us the message. In the meantime, there was a question at the back, and I'm sorry, I cannot see your name.
Thank you very much, Chair. Sandy Trees, House of Lords, and United Against Rabies Forum. Thanks for the excellent talks this morning. We've heard about data, we've heard about integration, we've heard about One Health. But can I ask, how well are the data systems of WHO, WOA, and FAO integrated? Can they talk to themselves and analyze things in concert?
Thank you. And there's also, I'm told, a comment online from Tanya Carolina Puma Olgun. Over to you. And there's also a Slido question. Is this the same? It's a different question. Let's see the Slido question. So how can NTD work together systematically? NTD, how could we co-create care package? Guess maybe a question for health system colleagues. Is a WASH and NTD working together guide disseminated mainly through WASH channels, or is it well absorbed in the NTD community as well? Are we in the position to have the question online? Oh, more. Any experience of anyone involved in a pilot program for chemo with a single dose of rifampicin for leprosy, low burden? Research seems to be the poor parent of the NTD program. I guess that's good package of questions. Maybe the best way is to quickly give the floor back to all the the panelists, the 1, 2, 3, 7 panelists, and see if they want to react to these comments, starting with you.
Thank you, Ivan, and thank you very much for those questions. Just 2 maybe quick reflections. First of all, to the enthusiasm from Julia, I think this is the translation into reality is where, of course, everybody would like to focus on. One of the mechanisms that has been used by different programs is to really think through from a primary healthcare lens each of the strategic and operational levers. Aidan was mentioning IA 2030, and the work on immunization has actually taken it forward through an immunization for primary healthcare frame of action. So there are some lessons that we can build on there, and perhaps that's something to consider for the future. I think the question on co-creating care packages is a really important one. That's, of course, the focus on national leadership to define the packages of care as based on the drive towards universal health coverage. So I think that's the strategic entry point for all of these discussions in terms of strategic levers, political commitment, governance, finance, and engagement from the primary healthcare lens would allow us to focus in on those co-creation of packages, ensuring that NTDs are not out there, but inside the entirety of the packages of services. Thanks, Ivan.
Thank you. I'm told the interpreters kindly agree to go until 12:15. So thank you so much to you up there. And knowing that we have a hard stop in 15 minutes, Susan, some reactions to the questions that have been?
No, I mean, just for me, I think it just in the 3-4 years that I've been working with the NTD program off and on, I just want to echo that I do see this real sea change and just the commitment to continue working together, whether it's from the financing or the UHC health system strengthening perspective, and how to really find those opportunities for alignment, defragmentation, and yeah, look forward to continuing the discussion.
Wonderful. Chikwe, if you're still with us, some reactions to the comments or to the other presentations that were made?
Yeah, thanks, Ivan. I think there was a question at the end on whether the for 3-4 organizations we're working together to share data. And we're working very hard towards that since the quadripartite agreement was signed. And last year we completed a One Health intelligence scoping study and now trying to implement some of that. But to be honest, to go back, that the work we can do at the global level really depends on how we are collaborating and coordinating at the national level. And just to bring one thing into the picture, at the recently concluded World Health Assembly, the one thing that I noted the most was the number of requests from countries that are setting up new centers for disease control or new national public health agencies. And this is really in response to the pandemic, but it also provides a great opportunity for NTDs. There's a coming together of resourcing at the national level to build a platform approach, whether it's to lab, to surveillance, to countermeasures. And I think it's very important that the NTD community is part of these institutions being established, and that we don't need to maintain the control program model down to the lowest level. We really have to, even if we maintain that at the global level, at the national level, really leverage on the institutional opportunity and the domestic funding going into these institutions at the moment to make sure that the NTD agenda is very much part of that conversation happening now, whether it's in data collection and sharing, laboratory capacity, countermeasures, supply chain management. All of these for the first time are receiving not just global attention from global funders, but local attention by governments setting up these institutions on their own. And so that's my final word to leave with this. So encourage us to stay on the ball in terms of the institutions being set up by many countries across the world. Back to you, Ivan.
Thank you, Chikwe. This is a powerful comment, also considering your previous achievements in the National CDC of Nigeria. Sophie, some reactions to the comments or online questions?
Sure, thanks. So there were some comments around the toolkit that was developed. I just wanted to say that this toolkit was developed in collaboration with the NNN, so including many of our NTD partners. It was actually developed based on real life program experiences, including NTD programs. So I think when the questions about dissemination among only WASH channel, that's not the case. There's been workshops at many of our NTD events as well, in addition to the WASH events. And I just wanted to say as well that we're going to be releasing the Open WHO course later this month as well to further promote dissemination among both our WASH and NTD communities. And as far as sharing data, we've been working on this for the last couple of years, and that's definitely an area that we'd like to strengthen further moving forward.
Thank you. Over to you, Mark, if you want to react or comment.
I'll speak to this question about research being the poor parents. I'd just like to remind everybody, I think we're all aware that without research, there would be no roadmap. The fact that there is PCP, preventive chemotherapy programs, based on modeling efforts and field investigations into the effectiveness of different benzimidazoles, it is fundamental to PCP. My first visit to WHO when I was a PhD student was to talk about the issue of preventive chemotherapy. It wasn't called that then, but the basis of treating co-infections using similar drugs and so on. So I've seen this develop over my research career. And I think there has been something of a move away from understanding how research can contribute to everything. There is a need for lab-based, field-based, database research. It doesn't have to be massively expensive. Oftentimes, at least in the UK, master's students pay to do their own research. They pay to be on a course. PhD students pay to be on a course. Every student pays in the UK now. That's a controversial point. They shouldn't, but they do. And I think there are many ways in which quality research can take place. There just needs to be some coordinated activity around it. Scholarships, bursaries, foundations can invite students to conduct research along a certain program. It's done in other areas. Why not within NTDs? And it is very sporadic at the moment, and everybody publishes or perishes, and we all have our day jobs as well. But I think there is definitely a room for all types of research to be encouraged and the outputs to be used to help in a wider program.
Thank you, Mark. I'm told we have to finish at 10, so a 1-minute comment from Graham and then from Junxian, then we'll go for lunch.
Thanks very much, Chair. I'd like to tackle the, systematic work, and I strongly feel, Habitat, this is our sort of view. Multisectorality comes alive at the local level. It's truly at local authority level and city level that you can really make multisectorality work. And because we've got to bring in things like climate change, WASH, but also softer things, the governance issues, we really have a great opportunity that we can tap into by working at the local level to develop some ideas. So I think that's the way we're going to see some big moves forward. City officials don't necessarily think disease specific. They think about groups of diseases, and I think it makes good sense to lump NTDs obviously together with vector-borne diseases included, and put those forward as a package, and to look at what interventions you can do at the local level to address a range of NTDs, not just one. Thank you.
Yes, just some reflection about One Health and also Professor Lotfree, the question about how these organizations really work together on One Health. I think the One Health Joint Plan of Action is an overarching document to guide the collaboration. And also these 4 organizations, FAO, WHO, WOHA, and UNEP, we established a secretariat. It's really work on daily basis, focusing on different topics. And also there are subgroups established, for example, some working group looking at the One Health intelligence platform try to synergize, avoid any overlapping duplication. And also the work is looking at a One Health mapping tool, and we have One Health investment at a country level, One Health profiling. Those are all aims to really synergize effort and really work together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Et Saucé pour un commentaire final.
Merci beaucoup. Sorry for taking it in for just 1 minute. Starting with the universal health coverage, thank you, Sham. We have been talking about, NTDs as, NTD index as indicator or tracer for universal health coverage and health equity. I think we need to continue having this consistency from the SDG indicator to the high level, meeting on USC during the UNGA. It's very important to make sure that we don't just mention NTDs as one sentence or at the end of one sentence when we talk about HIV, TB, malaria, and NTDs. We need real consistency. And on the research side, Mark, this is so important. Mark is busy. I'm commenting on the research. I don't want research to be neglected because sometimes we think it's always complex, but and long term. And I kept saying, when we respond to outbreak, we always do research implementation because we are, performance-based, oriented. We look at our performance on a daily basis. We see it's not working. We have to change it. You need to change it with the communities. We need to test new approaches. So we need to also be flexible in the way we are implementing NTD's program. But as we said earlier, we had huge gap to also fill in terms of real coordinated R&D to look at all level of research and implementation. And on the One Health side, so we have made some effort to, bridge the IHR and the PVS. The PVS is the equivalent of the IHR from the veterinary sector. It's the performance of veterinary services because we are not really talking together. And we have done a lot of work when we go for joint external evaluation of IHR to make sure that we work with veterinary services. But on the data side, we need to do a lot, as highlighted by Chikwe at county level, to make sure that the collaborative surveillance will lead to concrete outcome in terms of early warning, because we can see some diseases already in the animal sector. We know that the risk for the human health is increased, and we use early warning for actions. We also use that collaborative surveillance for rapid detection, but also coordinated response using what Chikwe highlighted about the emergency operation centers, because we don't need to create parallel operation centers. Polio is using the EOCs, health emergencies, and for NTDs, we need to acknowledge outbreaks and use also emergency operation center in a more coherent manner. Thank you.
Bon appétit.